Hello, my dear friend. Before we begin, I'd like you to make yourself as comfortable as possible. Adjust your pillow, take a slow, deep breath, and gently close your eyes. Let the outside world fade away until it is just you and my voice. Keep the volume low, just enough so you can hear each word softly, like a whisper in the quiet. Lie still and let your body grow heavier, as if the bed is slowly pulling you into its gentle embrace. Tonight, we begin the very first story in our series of Boring History for Sleep, a slow journey through quiet moments of the past, with no rush, no hurry, only calm words, carrying you deeper into rest. This is the rise of the glassmakers in Venice. Before we drift away together, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and let us bring you many more nights of gentle storytelling. Now, let us begin. In the stillness of the Venetian lagoon, long before the sound of tourists filled its narrow streets and the rumble of motorboats echoed under its bridges, Venice was a quiet collection of small islands, connected by wooden walkways and humble ferries. The air carried the faint scent of salt, the sound of oars dipping into the water, and the slow rhythm of daily life. In these early centuries, Venice was a place of merchants and fishermen, a city still finding its identity in the trade routes between the East and the West. Among the many goods that passed through its ports were small, delicate objects, glass beads, colored vessels, and simple panes that caught the light in a way unlike anything else. They were not yet Venetian creations. These early pieces came from distant lands, from the shores of Syria and Egypt, from the markets of Constantinople, where the art of glassmaking had been known for centuries. But Venetians, always attentive to what could be learned and what could be improved, began to take notice. They saw the way glass could be shaped, the way it could hold both strength and fragility, and how, in the right hands, it could become a thing of beauty and great value. In the beginning, Venice did not have its own glassmaking tradition. The city imported not only the finished products, but also the knowledge, drawing skilled craftsmen from abroad. Slowly, small workshops began to appear, tucked into corners of the city, where furnaces glowed faintly in the night. These early glassmakers were few, their work simple compared to what would come later, but the foundations were being laid. By the 12th century, Venice was growing wealthy from trade. Its ships traveled far, carrying spices, silks, and precious goods across the Mediterranean. The city's merchants understood that certain luxuries could command higher prices, and glass, clear, colored, or gilded, was one of them. Venetian leaders began to realize that by producing such items themselves, rather than relying solely on imports, they could not only keep the profits within the city, but also control the quality and reputation of the goods. Yet glassmaking was not without its dangers. The furnaces required intense heat, and in a city built largely of wood, fire was a constant threat. There were whispers of accidents, small blazes that flared too quickly, workshops that left only ashes behind. It was in response to this danger that a decision was made, one that would shape the history of Venetian glass forever. The glassmakers would be moved out of the heart of the city. They would be relocated to the nearby island of Murano, a short distance away across the lagoon, where their work could continue without the same risk of devastating the city with fire. This decision, taken in the late 13th century, was not merely about safety. It also served to concentrate the craft in one place, making it easier for the city to watch over its artisans and protect their techniques from being copied by outsiders. The relocation marked the beginning of Murano's rise as the world's most famous center for glassmaking. On this quiet island, surrounded by the waters of the lagoon, the furnaces could burn day and night. The glow from their flames was said to be visible from passing boats after sunset, a soft orange against the darkening sky. Here, in the hum of steady work, Venice began to develop its own glassmaking traditions, blending the knowledge brought from distant lands with innovations of its own. The earliest Murano glass was often functional, simple cups, bottles, and window panes. But the artisans were already experimenting with form and color. They learned to add minerals that would create deep blues, emerald greens, and rich ambers. They worked on making the glass clearer, more flawless, free from the tiny bubbles that marred lesser work. And slowly a style emerged, elegant, precise, and unmistakably Venetian. In these early days, the glassmakers of Murano were not yet the celebrated masters they would become. But the seeds had been planted, the furnaces burned, the workshops hummed, and the city's leaders watched closely, knowing that something of great value was beginning to take shape in the glow of those island flames. As the years passed, the decision to move the glassmakers to Murano proved to be more than just a precaution against fire. It created an island unlike any other in the Venetian lagoon, one where the air was scented faintly with smoke and molten sand, where the steady glow of furnaces seemed to mark the rhythm of life as clearly as the tide. From the moment the first artisans arrived, Murano began to hum with a quiet, focused energy. The city of Venice quickly realized that this concentration of skill could be turned into something far greater. Venetian leaders understood that glassmaking was not merely a craft. It was a source of wealth, a symbol of status, and perhaps most importantly, a closely guarded secret. And so laws were written, laws that would protect this art and ensure that the knowledge remained within the lagoon's waters. The most famous of these decrees was simple in wording, yet powerful in effect. Glassmakers were forbidden to leave Venice. Any artisan who tried to take their skills abroad risked not only the loss of their property, but also severe punishment, even death. The city did not want its techniques to be copied by foreign rivals. The recipes for the clearest glass, the methods for shaping it into delicate forms, the secrets of adding gold leaf or twisting colored threads through its surface. These were to remain Venetian property. At the same time, the Republic rewarded its glassmakers with privileges. They were granted certain freedoms, such as exemption from prosecution for some debts, and their daughters were permitted to marry into noble families, a rare honor for craftsmen. The glassmakers of Murano occupied a curious place in society. They were artisans, yet they were treated with a degree of respect and influence uncommon for their trade. Within the high-walled workshops of Murano, the work continued to evolve. Artisans experimented with cristallo, a remarkably clear and pure form of glass that would become one of Venice's most prized exports. They learned to imitate the look of precious stones, to create intricate mirrors with polished surfaces that reflected a room's candlelight like pools of still water, and to craft delicate goblets so fine that they seemed almost weightless in the hand. This period also saw the development of filigrana glass, where threads of white or colored glass were worked into intricate patterns, and latimo, an opaque white glass that mimicked porcelain. These innovations did not happen quickly. They were the result of decades of small adjustments, of trial and error, of knowledge passed from master to apprentice, in a tradition that valued patience above all. Outside the workshops, the canals of Murano carried the finished pieces back to the heart of Venice, where merchants sold them to wealthy Venetians and foreign visitors alike. The demand grew steadily, and so too did the reputation of Murano glass. By the 15th century, owning a piece of Venetian glass had become a mark of refinement across Europe. Kings, queens, and nobles sought it for their tables and their palaces, not only for its beauty, but also for the prestige it carried. Yet even as its fame spread, the art remained a guarded treasure. No written manuals were allowed to leave the island. Even the apprentices were bound by oaths of secrecy, sworn to protect the methods they had been taught. The city's leaders feared the loss of their monopoly, for they knew that if the secrets escaped, so too would much of Venice's advantage. And so Murano remained both open and closed, a place where trade and ideas flowed freely into the island, but from which the craft itself was never permitted to flow out. As the 15th century drew on, the glassmakers refined their techniques to levels unmatched anywhere else in the world. The soft glow of the furnaces, the rhythmic turning of the glassblowers' pipes, and the quiet hiss as molten glass met the cool tools of the bench became the heartbeat of Murano. Here, in the small island's workshops, the traditions deepened, the skills sharpened, and the reputation of Venetian glass solidified into something enduring. It was not yet at the height of its fame, but the path had been set, and the world was beginning to take notice of the wonders being created in the glow of Murano's fires. By the dawn of the 16th century, the name Murano had already begun to echo across the courts and merchant houses of Europe. The island's glassmakers had refined their craft to such a degree that their creations were spoken of with the same admiration reserved for fine silk from the East or rare spices from distant seas. This was the beginning of what many would call the golden age of Venetian glass. The Republic of Venice, wise in its handling of trade, understood the value of prestige as much as profit. Murano glass was not simply a commodity. It was a symbol of the city's refinement, skill, and control over the luxury markets. Ambassadors carried pieces as diplomatic gifts, merchants displayed them proudly to entice buyers, and wealthy families commissioned special designs for their feasts, weddings, and ceremonies. Each piece, whether a simple drinking vessel or an elaborate chandelier, bore the invisible mark of its origin, for no other place could match the clarity, lightness, and intricate beauty that the Murano furnaces produced. In the workshops, the atmosphere was both disciplined and creative. The masters, often belonging to families who had been in the trade for generations, presided over teams of apprentices and assistants. The work was divided carefully. One man would gather molten glass on the end of a blowpipe, another would shape it with wooden paddles soaked in water to keep them from burning, and another would add delicate threads of color or gilded patterns. Timing was everything. The glass had to remain at just the right temperature, soft enough to shape, but firm enough to hold its form. The artisans worked in a quiet rhythm, communicating more with gestures than with words, each movement a product of long practice. This was the era in which some of Murano's most famous innovations took shape. Cristallo, that clear and nearly flawless glass perfected in the previous century, was now produced in greater quantities and in more elaborate forms. The filigrana technique reached new heights, with complex lattices of color running through delicate cups and bowls. Enameling became more refined, allowing for scenes and patterns to be painted directly onto the glass and then fused into its surface by heat. Chandeliers with cascading arms and droplets began to appear in Venetian palaces, their light scattering across mirrored walls. Murano mirrors themselves became objects of envy, with their large, polished surfaces reflecting candlelight in a way no rival could achieve. These mirrors were so prized that they were sometimes mounted in elaborate frames of gilded wood or silver, becoming central features of grand reception rooms. The glassmakers guarded their methods more fiercely than ever. While the Republic rewarded them with privileges, it also maintained strict watch over their movements and their loyalties. Occasionally, stories would circulate of an artisan tempted by foreign rulers with promises of gold and land if they would reveal their secrets. Some who tried to leave were brought back, their attempts punished severely. The Republic's monopoly depended on the craft staying within its borders, and so the balance of reward and restriction continued. Beyond the island, Murano glass began to appear in inventories of royal households from France to Spain, from the Habsburg courts to the Ottoman palaces. It traveled by ship across the Mediterranean and beyond, wrapped carefully in straw and cloth to protect it on long journeys. Merchants spoke of its fragility, but also its resilience, how a thin goblet could seem as delicate as a soap bubble yet survive decades if treated with care. Back in Venice, the demand for glass supported an entire network of related trades: the makers of tools, the suppliers of the purest sand and minerals, the merchants who arranged sales abroad. The glassmakers themselves became figures of both respect and quiet mystery, their skill acknowledged as something rare and nearly magical. In the evenings, when the furnaces still glowed against the dark waters of the lagoon, the island would settle into a hush, the day's work complete. Yet inside the workshops, the masters would sometimes linger, turning a piece in their hands, studying the play of light through its surface, imagining what might be possible tomorrow. The Golden Age was not a sudden arrival, but a slow unfolding, each year adding another layer of skill, reputation, and beauty to the legacy of Murano glass. And though its fame now stretched across continents, its heart remained the same: a small island in the Venetian lagoon, where fire and sand met under the careful hands of artisans who saw in their work not just a trade, but a lifelong devotion to perfection. By the middle of the 17th century, the golden glow of Murano's reputation faced its first true shadows. For centuries, Venice had enjoyed a near monopoly on the most beautiful glass in Europe. But as trade routes expanded and knowledge slowly leaked beyond the lagoon, competitors began to emerge. In France, England, and the Netherlands, glassmakers experimented with their own techniques, sometimes luring away skilled artisans despite the Republic's strict laws. The spread of knowledge was gradual, often carried in whispers, in half-remembered methods, in small fragments of the carefully guarded secrets that had once been the exclusive pride of Murano. Some rivals succeeded in producing high-quality glass of their own, especially mirrors, which the French court began to favor as it developed its own production at Saint-Gobain. This was a blow to Venice, for mirrors had been one of its most profitable exports. Still, Murano retained advantages that could not be easily replicated. Its artisans possessed not only technical skill, but also a sense of proportion, elegance, and subtlety that came from generations of refinement. The island's furnaces continued to turn out works of remarkable clarity and delicacy, even as the styles of Europe shifted. The 17th century was a time of grandeur, of ornate decoration, of displays meant to impress. In response, Murano glassmakers adapted. They created more elaborate chandeliers, heavier with crystal drops and twisting arms. They experimented with richly colored glass, deep reds and cobalt blues, gold-flecked surfaces that caught the light in 1,000 small flashes. They produced goblets with intricate stems shaped like dolphins or twisted ropes, vessels with lids topped by delicate finials, and elaborate table centerpieces meant to astonish guests at banquets. The Republic of Venice, aware that its political power was beginning to wane in the face of larger European states, leaned ever more heavily on its image as a place of unmatched artistry and craftsmanship. Glassmaking, along with lace from Burano and fine shipbuilding, became part of the city's identity as a producer of luxury goods. Murano glass was presented not merely as an object, but as a piece of Venice itself, an embodiment of its beauty, its refinement, and its centuries of tradition. Yet there were challenges beyond foreign competition. Political tensions in Europe disrupted trade routes, and wars sometimes made it dangerous for merchant ships to carry luxury goods. Economic downturns reduced the number of wealthy patrons able to afford elaborate glass. In these times, the glassmakers turned to producing simpler items for local markets, though they never abandoned the more intricate work that defined their reputation. The adaptability of the Murano artisans lay not in changing their essence, but in adjusting the details. They could make a sturdy drinking vessel for a tavern just as well as they could create a jeweled goblet for a nobleman's feast. They learned to blend traditional designs with new influences, sometimes incorporating shapes inspired by the East or by the Baroque extravagance sweeping through Europe. In this way, Murano's craft did not stagnate, it evolved. And while it was no longer entirely alone in the world of fine glassmaking, it maintained a distinct place. Even those who could find fine mirrors or crystal elsewhere often acknowledged that Murano pieces carried a warmth, a liveliness that others lacked. The furnaces of the island continued to burn, the artisans continued to pass their skills from master to apprentice, and the island's name remained a synonym for beauty and glass. In the evenings, when the canals reflected the flicker of the workshop fires, it might have seemed to a visitor that little had changed, that Murano's glassmakers were still at the very center of the world's admiration. And in a sense they were, for the art they practiced was not simply about keeping pace with the times, but about holding on to something timeless, something that could pass through the hands of one generation to the next, without losing the touch of those who came before. In this way, even in the face of competition and shifting fortunes, Murano adapted without ever surrendering the heart of its craft. As the 18th century unfolded, Murano's glassmakers continued to work with the same care and precision that had made their name famous for centuries. Yet the world beyond the Venetian lagoon was changing in ways that neither fire nor skill could entirely control. The Republic of Venice, once a formidable maritime power, was slowly losing its political and economic dominance. Trade routes that had once been secure were now contested by other nations, and the luxury markets that had sustained Murano's prosperity began to feel the strain of competition and shifting tastes. Across Europe, the Enlightenment was encouraging a new appreciation for science and practicality, and some of the extravagance that had once characterized noble courts was giving way to more restrained styles. Still, there remained a place for beauty, and Murano adapted by refining rather than abandoning its traditions. Artisans began producing pieces that balanced elegance with function, mirrors with cleaner lines, chandeliers with fewer but more precisely cut drops, tableware that was graceful yet sturdy. The glass was as flawless as ever, the colors as rich, but the design spoke to a quieter kind of sophistication. This was also a time when Murano began to feel the influence of neoclassical styles, inspired by the rediscovery of ancient Roman and Greek art. Shapes became simpler, symmetry was favored, and decoration, though still present, was more measured. The island's glassmakers proved themselves capable of meeting these new demands without losing the distinct Venetian touch that set their work apart. Yet the political changes of the late 18th century brought challenges far greater than shifts in style. In 1797, the Republic of Venice fell to Napoleon Bonaparte, ending more than 1,000 years of independence. Under French rule and later Austrian control, the city's industries were reorganized to fit into broader imperial economies. Some workshops closed, unable to adjust to new regulations or the loss of traditional markets. Others struggled to keep their furnaces burning as resources became harder to obtain. For a time, the very survival of Murano's glassmaking tradition was uncertain. But even in these years of disruption, the craft did not vanish. A few dedicated families continued to work, preserving techniques that had been handed down for generations. They maintained their secrets, not for the sake of profit alone, but out of a deep sense of identity. For them, glassmaking was as much a part of Murano as the lagoon's waters or the sound of church bells in the distance. As the 19th century began, new forces entered the scene. The Industrial Revolution was transforming manufacturing across Europe, introducing machines that could produce glass more quickly and cheaply than any artisan's hand. Mass production meant that items once considered luxuries, simple drinking glasses, window panes, basic mirrors, were now available to a much wider public. Yet this same development created an opportunity for Murano, for it made the distinction between ordinary glass and the island's artistry even clearer. Murano could not compete with factories on speed or volume, but it could offer something they could not: the human touch, the subtle imperfections that revealed the presence of a craftsman, the knowledge that a piece was not just made, but created. In response, the glassmakers began to focus more on artistic and decorative pieces, on designs that celebrated their skill rather than trying to mimic the efficiency of industrial methods. This shift marked the beginning of Murano's transformation from primarily a producer of luxury household goods to a center for collectible art glass. By the mid-19th century, with Venice now part of the Austrian Empire, Murano glass was finding new audiences among travelers and collectors. The island's workshops became places not only of production, but also of demonstration, where visitors could watch a master shape molten glass into a vase or figurine. For many, the experience was as valuable as the object itself, a glimpse into a living tradition that had endured wars, political change, and economic upheaval. And so, even in an age of change, Murano remained faithful to its identity, adapting to new realities without losing the glow of its furnaces or the quiet pride of its artisans. As the 19th century moved toward its final decades, Murano's glassmaking heritage stood at a crossroads. The challenges of industrial competition had pushed the island to redefine its place in the world. But it was also a time of renewed curiosity about traditional craftsmanship. Across Europe, a growing appreciation for the handmade was taking root, partly as a reaction to the uniformity of machine production. In this environment, Murano found an opportunity not only to survive, but to rediscover its former prestige. Key to this revival were a handful of determined families and entrepreneurs who recognized that Murano's strength lay in the uniqueness of its work and in the centuries of knowledge embedded in every technique. Some reopened workshops that had gone quiet during the years of political change, bringing back furnaces that had once cooled to ash. Others sought to document old methods, gathering the wisdom of elderly artisans before it could be lost. In these workshops, traditional forms returned: delicate goblets, intricate filigree, mirrors framed with glass flowers. But there was also room for experimentation. Artisans began to study the works of the Renaissance masters, not only to reproduce them faithfully, but to adapt them for contemporary tastes. They experimented with new colors, more vivid and varied than in the past, achieved through the addition of carefully measured minerals. They played with form, creating sculptural pieces that were as much art as they were functional objects. The late 19th century also saw Murano re-enter the international stage through exhibitions and world fairs. At events in Paris, Vienna, and London, Murano glass was displayed alongside the finest works of other nations, drawing admiration for its clarity, color, and intricate craftsmanship. These exhibitions were more than just opportunities for sales. They were a reassertion of identity, a reminder to the world that Murano was still a leader in its field. Visitors were often astonished to see the process itself: the gathering of molten glass on the end of a blowpipe, the swift turning and shaping, the transformation of glowing liquid into a solid object of beauty. These demonstrations became part of Murano's charm, offering a glimpse behind the scenes into a tradition that had once been fiercely hidden from outsiders. By the early 20th century, Murano was once again firmly established as a center of fine glassmaking. But the new era brought new influences. The Art Nouveau movement, with its flowing lines and natural forms, inspired glassmakers to explore organic shapes, vases that curved like leaves, bowls with edges like flower petals, and pieces in swirling colors that evoked water, smoke, or flame. This willingness to embrace change while maintaining the essence of Venetian glass kept Murano relevant in a world where tastes shifted more quickly than ever before. The island's economy began to rely more heavily on tourism as well. Travelers to Venice made the short journey to Murano not only to buy glass, but to watch it being made, to feel the heat of the furnaces, and hear the quiet concentration of the artisans. Shops and showrooms multiplied, offering everything from small souvenirs to large, commissioned works destined for grand homes abroad. While some worried that catering to visitors might dilute the artistry, many workshops managed to balance commercial needs with the preservation of high-quality craftsmanship. And so, as the 20th century began, Murano entered a period of cautious optimism. It had weathered political upheaval, economic challenges, and the rise of industrial production. Yet it remained a place where fire, sand, and human skill came together in ways that no machine could replicate. The furnaces still glowed against the lagoon's dark waters at night, just as they had for centuries, and the people of Murano still spoke of their craft with the quiet pride of those who know. They are keepers of something both fragile and enduring. The first half of the 20th century would test Murano's endurance in ways that even centuries of political change and economic pressure had not. The outbreak of the First World War in 1914 disrupted trade routes and cut off many of the foreign markets on which Murano depended. Luxury goods were no longer a priority for much of Europe, and the demand for art glass fell sharply. Many workshops closed their doors, not because the artisans had lost their skill, but because there were simply too few buyers to sustain the fires of the furnaces. Some glassmakers found work producing more practical items, while others left the island temporarily to seek employment elsewhere. Yet even during these lean years, the knowledge of the craft was preserved. Families passed techniques quietly from one generation to the next, teaching in private when the workshops were silent, ensuring that the skills would not be lost when better times returned. When the war ended in 1918, there was a slow rebuilding. Tourists began to trickle back to Venice, curious about the city's art and history, and Murano once again became part of that journey. The 1920s brought a modest revival, helped by the Art Deco movement, which valued bold shapes and striking contrasts. Murano artisans adapted, creating pieces with geometric patterns, rich colors, and strong silhouettes that appealed to modern tastes. They also continued to produce the classic styles that had long been associated with the island, offering buyers both tradition and innovation. The Second World War, however, brought an even greater disruption. Italy's involvement in the conflict, the occupation of Venice, and the scarcity of materials all but halted production. Fuel for the furnaces was limited, shipping routes were dangerous, and many artisans were called to military service. Once again, the survival of Murano glassmaking depended on resilience and patience. When peace finally returned in 1945, the world was eager to rebuild, not only cities and economies, but also the enjoyment of beauty and culture that had been overshadowed by years of hardship. Murano was ready to meet that need. The post-war years saw a remarkable surge in creativity. Freed from the constraints of wartime scarcity, artisans experimented with new forms, techniques, and colors. Modernist influences mingled with centuries-old traditions, producing works that felt both timeless and contemporary. Some pieces were sleek and minimalist, echoing the design trends of the era, while others embraced vibrant patterns and playful shapes. The tourist trade expanded rapidly in the 1950s and 1960s as international travel became more accessible. Visitors to Venice made Murano an essential stop, eager to see the glassblowers at work and to take home a piece of the island's artistry. Workshops began offering live demonstrations, allowing guests to watch as glowing molten glass was shaped into delicate vases, graceful animals, or elaborate chandeliers. For many, the sight of a master twisting and blowing a shapeless mass into a finished work of art was unforgettable. These demonstrations not only sold glass, they sold the story of Murano, a story of endurance, skill, and beauty passed down through generations. The mid-century period also saw Murano glass gain recognition in the broader world of art. Leading designers and architects collaborated with Murano masters, incorporating their work into interiors, furniture, and large-scale decorative installations. This visibility brought new prestige and helped cement Murano's reputation as a place where tradition and innovation could coexist. Despite these successes, the island never forgot how fragile its fortunes could be. The memory of wars and economic downturns remained, reminding artisans of the importance of adaptability. But in the soft light of the lagoon, with the glow of the furnaces reflecting on the water at night, it must have seemed that Murano had entered yet another chapter of resilience, a time when its glass was not merely a remnant of the past, but a living tradition, renewed and ready for the future. By the final decades of the 20th century, Murano's glass-making tradition had once again proven its resilience. The world around it had changed dramatically, politically, economically, and culturally, but the small island in the Venetian lagoon continued to be known across the globe as the home of exquisite glass. This was a time of both opportunity and challenge, for while the market for luxury and collectible items was growing, so too was the pressure from globalization, mass production, and shifting consumer tastes. International tourism reached unprecedented levels in the 1970s and 1980s, and Venice became one of the most visited cities in the world. For Murano, this brought a steady flow of visitors, eager to see the furnaces in action and to take home something crafted by hand. Glass-blowing demonstrations became almost as important as the glass itself, with artisans shaping vases, figurines, and elaborate sculptures in front of small crowds. The sound of the blowpipe turning, the hiss of water on hot tools, and the sight of glowing molten glass stretching and forming under skilled hands became part of the island's identity. At the same time, a growing collector's market began to value Murano pieces, not just as souvenirs, but as works of art. Mid-century designs from the 1950s and 1960s gained recognition for their innovation, and living masters were celebrated for pushing the boundaries of what glass could do. Galleries in New York, London, and Tokyo began exhibiting Murano glass alongside fine art, while wealthy clients commissioned bespoke works for their homes. This new attention brought prestige, but it also brought imitation. Factories in other countries began producing glass in styles that mimicked Murano's, often at a fraction of the cost. Some tourists, unaware of the difference, purchased these cheaper imitations thinking they were genuine. To protect the authenticity of its craft, Murano began promoting the idea of certification, marking genuine pieces with labels or signatures to distinguish them from copies. For the artisans, the challenge was not only to maintain traditional quality, but also to adapt their designs for a more global audience. Some embraced bold modern styles, abstract sculptures, dramatic color contrasts, and experimental shapes, while others remained devoted to the classical forms that had defined Murano for centuries. This balance between innovation and tradition became the hallmark of the island's late 20th century identity. The era also brought new collaborations. Designers from outside Italy worked with Murano masters to create limited edition pieces that combined contemporary aesthetics with centuries-old techniques. These partnerships allowed Murano glass to reach markets and audiences it might otherwise have missed, blending the modern with the historic in ways that appealed to collectors and casual buyers alike. Yet, amid the innovation, the heart of the craft remained the same. In the quiet of the workshops, away from the showrooms and the tourist crowds, artisans still gathered molten glass from the furnace, shaped it with steady hands, and passed their knowledge to the next generation. Apprentices learned not only the techniques of glassblowing, but also the patience, discipline, and respect for tradition that the craft demanded. For all the changes in the world beyond the lagoon, Murano's rhythm remained tied to the turn of the blowpipe, the glow of the fire, and the transformation of raw sand and minerals into something luminous and enduring. As the 20th century drew to a close, Murano stood as both a symbol of continuity and a participant in an increasingly interconnected world. Its glass could be found in museums, in private collections, in the homes of those who valued beauty, and in the hands of travelers who remembered the moment they watched a shapeless, glowing mass become something impossibly delicate. The future was uncertain, as it always had been, but the island had faced uncertainty before and had always emerged with its furnaces still burning. In the warm reflection of firelight on the waters of the lagoon, Murano's story was still being told, one piece of glass at a time. The arrival of the 21st century brought with it a world that moved faster, communicated instantly, and was connected in ways that previous generations could scarcely have imagined. For Murano, this new era presented both fresh opportunities and complex challenges. The island's glassmakers, heirs to more than 7 centuries of tradition, now found themselves navigating a global market shaped by the internet, mass tourism, and shifting cultural tastes. Tourism remained a lifeline, with millions of visitors coming to Venice each year, many making the short boat trip to Murano to see the famous furnaces. The glass-blowing demonstrations that had captivated audiences for decades continued to be a central attraction, and for many visitors, the moment they watched a glowing sphere of molten glass transform into a vase or sculpture remained the highlight of their trip. Yet tourism was no longer just about the people who walked into a workshop. It was also about those who could browse, learn, and purchase from anywhere in the world. Online sales opened new markets, allowing Murano glass to reach customers in places that might never see the Venetian lagoon, but this also meant competing directly with the flood of imitations produced elsewhere. Factories from other countries, some using machines instead of skilled hands, began selling Murano-style glass online at a fraction of the cost of genuine Venetian work. To protect their heritage, Murano artisans and officials launched certification programs, introducing official marks and documentation to guarantee authenticity. Education became a key strategy, explaining to customers not only what made true Murano glass different, but also why that difference mattered. Authentic pieces carried the weight of history, the touch of the maker, and the subtle variations that revealed their human origins. These could not be replicated by mass production. At the same time, environmental concerns began to influence the craft. The traditional furnaces of Murano, fueled by natural gas, were energy-intensive and produced significant emissions. Rising energy costs, combined with regulations aimed at reducing environmental impact, placed new pressures on workshop owners. Some explored more efficient furnace designs or experimented with alternative energy sources, though always with caution, for any change in the heat and timing could alter the qualities of the glass. Artistic innovation continued to be a driving force in keeping Murano relevant. Many artisans embraced contemporary design movements, creating works that could be displayed in modern homes and galleries, while still showcasing the techniques that had been refined over centuries. Collaborations with architects, fashion designers, and contemporary artists brought Murano glass into new contexts, sometimes as part of large installations, sometimes as limited edition art pieces that blurred the line between function and sculpture. The collector's market also adapted to the new century. Auction houses began featuring Murano glass not only as decorative art, but also as investment pieces, recognizing that certain works, especially those from renowned 20th century masters, could appreciate significantly in value. This renewed attention to quality and provenance encouraged some workshops to focus on fewer, more exclusive pieces, emphasizing craftsmanship over quantity. Still, challenges remained. The global economic downturns of the early 21st century affected luxury markets, and the COVID-19 pandemic brought a sudden halt to tourism in Venice, closing showrooms and silencing furnaces for months. Yet when visitors returned, so did the determination of the island's artisans. The sight of the furnaces reigniting after the long quiet had carried a symbolic weight. It was another chapter in a story of survival. In this new age, Murano's identity rests on a delicate balance, honoring a heritage that is centuries old, while adapting to a world where trends shift quickly and competition comes from every corner of the globe. But if history has shown anything, it is that Murano's strength lies not only in its glass, but in the hands, hearts, and persistence of those who shape it. And as the flames continue to burn in the workshops, casting their warm glow over the waters of the lagoon, the story of Murano glass carries on, still beautiful, still enduring, still unmistakably Venetian. In the quiet hours of the evening, when the bustle of the day has faded, and the waters of the lagoon reflect the soft glow of the lamps, Murano takes on a stillness that feels timeless. The furnaces may dim for the night, their flames reduced to embers, but the memory of the day's work lingers in the air, the rhythmic turning of the blowpipe, the faint scent of smoke, the echo of footsteps across the workshop floor. It is in moments like these that the weight of Murano's legacy becomes most tangible. This small island has seen empires rise and fall, trade routes shift, and technologies transform the world beyond its shores. Yet its identity has remained rooted in the meeting of fire, sand, and human skill. Each piece of Murano glass carries within it the patience of centuries, the slow accumulation of knowledge passed from master to apprentice, and the belief that beauty is worth the time it takes to create. For visitors who step into a showroom or workshop, the experience is more than a transaction. It is a glimpse into a living tradition. They see not only the final piece, with its perfect form and luminous color, but also the invisible line that connects it to the goblets of Renaissance nobility, the mirrors of royal palaces, the chandeliers that once lit the grand salons of Europe. They may not know the names of all the artisans who came before, but their presence is felt in every curve, every polished surface, every tiny ripple in the glass that speaks of the human hand. Murano's legacy is also one of resilience. Wars, political upheavals, economic crises, and the challenges of mass production have all threatened to dim its fires. Yet each time, the island has found a way to adapt. It has done so not by abandoning its past, but by carrying it forward, allowing tradition to guide innovation rather than be replaced by it. In this way, Murano glass is both ancient and modern, rooted in techniques that have changed little in their essence, yet able to respond to new artistic visions and new generations of admirers. The 21st century has brought with it the speed of digital communication, the reach of global markets, and the constant pressure of imitation. Yet Murano continues to set itself apart. Authentic pieces are not merely objects, they are stories, each one shaped by the quiet discipline of the workshop and the unbroken chain of knowledge that makes this island unique. Collectors value them for their rarity and craftsmanship, but even those who buy a small vase or pendant as a memento take home something more than glass. They carry with them a fragment of Venice's spirit. Looking forward, Murano's future will depend, as it always has, on the hands of its artisans and the appreciation of those who understand the difference between something made quickly and something made well. Efforts to protect the island's heritage, from certification programs to cultural preservation initiatives, aim to ensure that the name Murano will always mean what it has meant for centuries: beauty born of skill, dedication, and fire. And so the story continues. Each day, the furnaces are lit, the blowpipes are turned, and the molten glass begins its transformation. Each night, the glow from the workshops reflects softly on the lagoon, just as it has for generations. In this interplay of light and water, of tradition and renewal, lies the essence of Murano, a place where history is not something kept in a museum, but something alive in the hands of those who work it. As long as there are those willing to tend the fire, to gather the molten mass and coax it into shape, Murano's glass will endure, carrying its legacy forward into the future, one luminous piece at a time. And now, our story comes to a gentle close. Before we drift into the next chapter of our journey, I would be so grateful if you could leave a like and subscribe to the channel so you can join me here again, night after night. Now, let us continue to the next story in our Boring History for Sleep series. Tonight, we slowly turn the page and begin how the compass slowly changed the world. Long before the compass became a familiar tool in the hands of sailors and explorers, the world was a far more uncertain place to navigate. People traveled by land and sea using the sun, the moon, the stars, and the shapes of the coastlines they knew by memory. On clear days, the position of the sun could tell you the direction. At night, the North Star offered a steady point in the sky for those who could see it. But these methods had their limits. Clouds could hide the heavens, storms could change familiar landmarks, and long journeys across open water meant that days or even weeks might pass without a clear view of land. It was in this world, where direction could be lost so easily, that the first idea of the compass began to emerge. The earliest origins of the compass can be traced back to ancient China, many centuries before it became known in Europe. The Chinese had discovered that a piece of naturally magnetic iron ore, known as lodestone, had the strange ability to align itself with the Earth's magnetic field. If suspended freely or floated on water, the stone would point toward the north-south axis. At first, this was more a curiosity than a navigational breakthrough. Early Chinese records suggest that the lodestone was used for fortune-telling and geomancy, helping to align buildings or choose auspicious locations. Over time, however, the practical value of this magnetic property began to be understood. By the Han Dynasty, more than 2,000 years ago, the Chinese had developed simple devices where a piece of lodestone was shaped into a spoon-like form and placed on a smooth bronze plate. The spoon would turn until it aligned itself with the Earth's poles, and though it was still not used widely for travel, the principle had been discovered. Gradually, the concept of using magnetism for direction began to spread. In the centuries that followed, craftsmen learned how to magnetize an ordinary piece of iron by rubbing it against lodestone. This magnetized iron could then be shaped into a needle and mounted so that it could turn freely. The earliest navigational compasses in China were likely used on land before they were adapted for sea travel, helping caravans find their way across vast and featureless landscapes where landmarks were few. By the 11th century, the Chinese had developed a compass design that could be used aboard ships, a needle mounted on a piece of wood or reed, floating in a bowl of water so it could pivot easily with the movement of the vessel. This floating compass became a vital tool for sailors navigating the rivers, coasts, and eventually the open seas. The idea of the compass traveled slowly along the trade routes, carried by merchants, scholars, and seafarers. Through contact between China and the Islamic world, knowledge of magnetism and directional needles made its way westward. Arab traders and navigators began using versions of the compass for their own voyages, particularly across the often cloudy waters of the Indian Ocean, where traditional methods could be unreliable. From there, the concept spread into the Mediterranean, arriving in Europe by the late 12th or early 13th century. In these early years of adoption, the compass did not replace older methods of navigation, but worked alongside them. Sailors still watched the stars, measured the sun's height, and read the winds and currents. But with a compass on board, they had a tool that could point the way even when the sky was hidden and the horizon offered no clues. This simple advantage, being able to hold a direction regardless of weather, would, over time, change the possibilities of travel and exploration. The earliest European compasses were crude by later standards, often just a magnetized needle balanced on a pin or floating on a small piece of cork in a bowl of water. Yet even in this basic form, they were enough to give mariners confidence to venture farther from shore. Journeys that might once have been delayed or abandoned because of overcast skies could now continue. The compass, in its earliest form, was not yet the polished, precise instrument it would become, but its quiet, steady movement marked the beginning of a transformation. Over the centuries, it would guide ships across oceans, armies across continents, and traders along routes that would knit the world more closely together. But in these first centuries, it was still a humble thing, just a needle, turning silently, offering direction to those who dared to trust it. By the 13th century, the compass had begun to find its place in the hands of sailors across the Mediterranean and beyond. It was still a modest device, often no more than a magnetized needle mounted on a sliver of wood floating in a small bowl of water. But its presence aboard a ship changed the very nature of navigation. Medieval mariners had long relied on the stars, the position of the sun, the color of the water, and the shapes of familiar coastlines. These methods worked well enough in certain conditions, but they demanded clear skies and known landmarks. In the unpredictable seas of the North Atlantic, or the vast stretches of the Mediterranean under heavy cloud, even the most experienced sailor could lose his bearings. The compass offered something new, a steady, reliable point of reference, unaffected by weather or the shifting of the waves. In these early centuries, the compass did not replace other skills, but enhanced them. Sailors still learned to read the night sky and the patterns of the wind, but the compass allowed them to hold a course with far greater confidence, especially during long crossings where land was out of sight for days. The knowledge of the magnetic needle spread along the busy trade routes of the medieval world. Genoese and Venetian merchants, already skilled navigators, quickly saw its value. So too did Arab and North African traders, whose voyages often crossed open stretches of sea, where a storm or fog could make traditional navigation nearly impossible. In the hands of such mariners, the compass became not merely a tool of convenience, but a safeguard against disaster. The impact on trade was gradual but profound. Merchant ships could now venture further and more directly between ports, shaving days off journeys and reducing the risks of becoming lost. This meant goods could move more predictably: spices from the east, wool from England, wine from France, silk from Byzantium, all carried across seas where the compass quietly guided the way. The increased reliability of long-distance sea travel also encouraged the creation of more detailed maps and charts. Medieval cartographers, inspired by the growing precision of navigation, began to produce portolan charts, remarkably accurate coastal maps marked with compass lines radiating from compass roses. These charts, often decorated with elaborate illustrations, were not simply works of art, but practical tools designed to be used alongside the compass to plot courses, with far greater accuracy than before. As the 14th century unfolded, the compass became an accepted part of a ship's equipment, much as the anchor or the sail. It was often housed in a small wooden box or mounted on a gimbal to keep it level as the ship rolled with the waves. Some were paired with a card marked with the principal winds and directions, allowing sailors to read their course at a glance. The device remained simple in its construction, yet its influence spread into the rhythms of daily life at sea. Night watches could keep a steady heading even when the stars were hidden. Captains could take bolder routes, confident that they could recover their bearings if the weather turned against them. And in an age when voyages could be measured not only in days, but in lives, this small assurance meant everything. On land, too, the compass found uses beyond the sea. Travelers across deserts or dense forests, where landmarks could vanish and paths twist into confusion, began to carry it. Armies on campaign found it useful for keeping formations moving in a chosen direction, especially under conditions where visibility was poor. Yet it was at sea that the compass truly transformed human movement. It allowed ports to grow more connected, trade to flow more freely, and distant lands to feel just a little closer. It was not a sudden revolution, but a steady change, unfolding over generations. A sailor setting out from Venice in 1250 might not think of himself as part of history, yet the compass in his kit was part of a chain of knowledge stretching from ancient China, through the Islamic world, into the heart of Europe. Slowly, almost quietly, it was beginning to reshape the map of human possibility. In the centuries to come, it would guide ships to shores they had never seen, carry explorers into oceans without end, and help knit together a world that had once been divided by distance and uncertainty. But in the medieval world, its magic was in its simplicity, a needle that always knew where north lay, even when the rest of the world seemed hidden from view. By the 15th century, Europe was on the threshold of a new era. The late medieval world had been shaped by trade networks that linked the Mediterranean with the markets of Asia through overland routes and coastal shipping. But these paths were limited, vulnerable to political shifts, and often controlled by powerful intermediaries. The desire for direct access to the riches of the East, spices, silk, precious stones, was growing, and so too was the curiosity about lands beyond the horizon. It was in this atmosphere of ambition and uncertainty that the compass came into its own as a tool that could make the unknown just a little less daunting. In the great seaports of Portugal, Spain, and Italy, shipbuilders and navigators worked together to prepare for longer voyages into unfamiliar waters. The caravel, with its nimble design and capacity for open ocean sailing, gave mariners the means, but the compass gave them the confidence. With a compass aboard, a captain could maintain a chosen course, even when land had been out of sight for days or weeks, and when the heavens were hidden by storms or fog. This reliability meant that voyages could push into the Atlantic without the constant fear of losing direction entirely. Portuguese explorers, encouraged by Prince Henry the Navigator, began to creep down the coast of Africa, each expedition going a little farther than the last. In these journeys, the compass worked alongside other tools such as the astrolabe and the quadrant, helping sailors fix their position and maintain a steady heading. The further they traveled, the more they relied on it. Winds could be unpredictable, currents could push a ship off course, and storms could drive them into uncharted waters, but the compass offered a fixed point in a shifting world. The Spanish, too, saw its value. When Christopher Columbus set sail in 1492 in search of a western route to Asia, he carried a compass as part of his essential equipment. During the long weeks at sea, far from any known coastline, the needle's steady movement was a reassurance, not only to Columbus, but also to the crews whose nerves were tested by the vast emptiness of the open ocean. The compass was not a perfect instrument. Mariners of the time were aware that its needle did not always point precisely to true north. a phenomenon we now understand as magnetic variation. In some regions, this discrepancy was small. In others, it was more pronounced. But even with this limitation, it remained vastly more reliable than steering solely by the stars or the sun. Over time, navigators learned to account for these variations, making their charts and directions ever more accurate. As the great voyages of discovery unfolded, Vasco da Gama's passage around the Cape of Good Hope to India, Ferdinand Magellan's circumnavigation of the globe, and countless other expeditions, the compass became as essential as sails or rigging. Without it, the vast distances of the world's oceans would have been far more forbidding. With it, coastlines were mapped, trade routes established, and connections forged between continents that had long been separated. The expansion of European exploration did not merely bring new lands into view, it reshaped the entire map of commerce, politics, and culture. Spices from the East, gold and silver from the Americas, and goods from Africa and Asia began to flow through European ports, enriching some nations and igniting rivalries among others. The compass, small and silent, was at the heart of this transformation. It did not power the ships or fill their sails with wind, but it gave them the means to trust in their direction when the rest of the world was unknown. By the close of the 15th century, it had moved from being an aid to navigation to a symbol of exploration itself. Every great voyage began with a course set by the needle. Every return to port owed something to its quiet guidance. It was an unassuming companion on the decks of history's most daring journeys, helping to carry humanity into a new age of global connection. And while other tools and techniques would evolve, the compass would remain a constant presence, its value proven in every mile of open sea crossed under its watch. By the 16th and 17th centuries, the compass was no longer a curiosity or a luxury. It had become a standard part of every serious voyage. It sat at the heart of a growing network of maritime empires, guiding fleets across oceans and helping shape the destinies of nations. The age of exploration had opened new routes and revealed vast territories, but it was the regular, reliable use of the compass that turned those discoveries into enduring connections. For Portugal, Spain, England, France, and the Netherlands, the compass allowed their ships to travel with greater speed and certainty, linking distant colonies and trading posts in a web that stretched across the globe. Portuguese navigators used it to maintain their long route around Africa to the Indian Ocean, bringing spices, silks, and porcelain back to Lisbon. Spanish galleons crossed the Atlantic with gold and silver from the Americas, then navigated the long Pacific crossing to trade with Asia through Manila. The English and Dutch relied on the compass to drive their competition in the East Indies, sending fleets thousands of miles to secure spices, tea, and textiles. In these long voyages, storms could batter a ship for days, currents could push it far from its intended course, and the sky could remain overcast for weeks, denying navigators the chance to use celestial measurements. The compass became the constant reference point that allowed them to recover their bearings and press onward. It reduced the risk of being lost at sea, which meant merchants and investors could have greater confidence in funding expeditions. This stability was essential for building the global trade networks that defined the era. The compass also transformed naval warfare. Fleets could coordinate movements over greater distances, maintaining formation even when out of sight of land. Admirals could plan complex maneuvers, knowing their ships could hold a heading in poor visibility. Naval battles were often decided not only by firepower, but by positioning, and the compass was an invisible ally in achieving that advantage. On land, the growing use of the compass and related navigational tools fed into advances in cartography. Map makers could plot coastlines more accurately, recording bearings taken with the compass to create charts that were far more reliable than those of previous centuries. These charts, in turn, made navigation safer and faster, creating a feedback loop in which better maps encouraged more exploration, and more exploration produced better maps. The influence of the compass went beyond the movement of goods and ships. It reshaped the rhythms of life in port cities around the world. Places like Lisbon, Seville, Amsterdam, and London became centers of maritime commerce, their wealth built on voyages that the compass made possible. Shipyards expanded, warehouses filled with goods from across the seas, and the hum of activity in the docks reflected a new global economy in which distant markets were tied together as never before. Yet even as the compass became a symbol of confidence and expansion, it retained an air of mystery, for many who used it. Sailors might know from experience that the needle pointed north, but few understood the invisible magnetic forces that made it so. Superstitions sometimes surrounded it, stories of its power to calm storms, or its potential to bring bad luck if mishandled. Despite the growing body of scientific study, for much of the general public, it remained a tool whose workings were accepted rather than fully explained. Over time, refinements improved its reliability. The dry compass, with a needle mounted above a compass card enclosed in a protective box, became common. Gimbals kept it level as the ship rolled, and increasingly precise markings allowed for more accurate readings. By the late 17th century, the compass was no longer just a floating needle in a bowl of water. It was a finely crafted instrument, essential to the expansion of European influence around the world. In this way, the compass was more than a navigator's aid. It was a cornerstone of an emerging global order. Empires rose on the strength of their fleets, and those fleets depended on the steady, silent movement of a needle to carry them across oceans. It was a small thing, easily overlooked amid the sails, cannons, and cargo. Yet without it, the grand ambitions of maritime powers might have remained dreams, bounded by the shore. By the 18th century, the compass was no longer just a practical tool for sailors and explorers. It had also become an object of study for scientists and thinkers of the Enlightenment. The Age of Reason, with its emphasis on observation, experimentation, and understanding the natural world, brought new attention to the forces that guided the compass needle. For centuries, mariners had noticed that the needle did not always point directly toward true north. This variation, later called magnetic declination, puzzled navigators. In some parts of the world, the difference was barely noticeable. In others, it could be several degrees, enough to cause significant navigational errors over long distances. Early sailors accepted this as one of the mysteries of the sea, but Enlightenment thinkers sought to explain it. Scholars began recording compass readings alongside the positions of the sun and stars, building detailed charts of magnetic variation across the globe. They found that the amount and direction of declination changed depending on where one stood on the Earth's surface, and in some places, it even shifted over time. This led to the realization that the Earth itself was magnetic, with a magnetic north that was not fixed at the same point as geographic north. These studies were not confined to scientists alone. Many experienced navigators became skilled observers, contributing data from their voyages to expand the understanding of magnetism. Naval officers, merchant captains, and explorers began keeping careful logs of compass readings, noting any deviations and comparing them to known landmarks. In doing so, they helped create more accurate navigation tables, allowing others to correct their courses with greater precision. The compass itself was also improved during this period. The traditional floating needle design was refined into the dry compass, where the magnetized needle was mounted on a pivot and connected to a compass card marked with directions. This design was enclosed in a protective case, shielding it from wind and spray. The addition of gimbals, rings that kept the compass level regardless of how the ship rolled or pitched, meant that readings could remain steady, even in rough seas. The Enlightenment's fascination with measurement and accuracy also extended to shipbuilding and navigation as a whole. Compasses were paired with sextants, chronometers, and increasingly detailed charts, creating a system of tools that allowed mariners to determine both their direction and their position with unprecedented reliability. This combination of instruments transformed navigation from an art guided largely by experience into a discipline grounded in science. The improved reliability of the compass meant that voyages could be planned with greater confidence. Explorers pushed into the Arctic and Antarctic regions, where the sun and stars might be invisible for months at a time, relying on their compasses to hold a steady course. Merchant fleets expanded their routes, carrying goods between continents with schedules that could be predicted more accurately than ever before. Naval fleets could maneuver across oceans with precision, coordinating movements over vast distances. The compass also began to appear more often on land. Surveyors used it to map territories, armies carried it into unfamiliar landscapes, and travelers brought pocket compasses on long journeys. In each of these settings, it provided a quiet reassurance, a simple certainty in a world that was still vast and often unmapped. By the close of the 18th century, the compass had moved beyond being merely a mariner's companion. It had become a symbol of human curiosity, and the drive to understand the natural world. It represented the meeting of ancient observation and modern science, a bridge between the practical needs of travel and the intellectual quest for knowledge. And while new discoveries in magnetism would continue into the next century, the compass of the Enlightenment stood as a finely honed instrument, as much a product of careful thought as of craftsmanship, guiding ships and people through both the known and the unknown. The 19th century brought a pace of change the world had never seen before. The Industrial Revolution transformed economies, technologies, and societies. And in this era of steamships, railroads, and expanding empires, the compass took on an even greater significance. It was no longer just a mariner's tool for guiding wooden sailing ships across the oceans. It became a trusted instrument on iron-hulled steam vessels, in the hands of surveyors mapping vast territories, and with explorers pushing into the most remote corners of the globe. On the seas, the shift from sail to steam meant that ships could travel faster and more directly, no longer entirely dependent on the wind. Yet speed brought its own risks. Steamships could travel great distances without stopping, crossing oceans in a matter of weeks instead of months, but their courses still had to be carefully maintained, especially in the open waters of the Atlantic or Pacific where landmarks were few. The compass remained central to this task, providing a constant point of reference regardless of the weather. Shipbuilders, however, faced a new challenge. The iron hulls and machinery of steamships interfered with the compass's accuracy, creating deviations in the needle's alignment. Navigators learned to account for these errors by calibrating their compasses using special reference points and adjusting for deviation tables, unique to each vessel. This process required precision, for even a small error could lead to hundreds of miles off course over a long voyage. On land, the compass became indispensable for surveying. Expanding empires needed accurate maps of their territories, whether for governance, resource extraction, or military planning. Surveyors used compasses alongside chains, theodolites, and later transits to measure distances and establish bearings. Railroads stretched across continents, their routes plotted with the help of compass bearings, connecting cities and ports in a network of steel that transformed trade and travel. The compass was also a companion for explorers, venturing into uncharted regions. In Africa, Asia, the Arctic, and the Americas, expeditions relied on it to navigate deserts, jungles, mountains, and ice fields. For these travelers, it was a lifeline when the landscape offered no clear direction, and when even the stars might be hidden for weeks by clouds or storms. Military forces also adopted the compass as standard equipment. Armies on campaign used it to maintain formation, plan movements, and coordinate operations in unfamiliar terrain. The growing precision of artillery required exact bearings, and the compass became part of the chain of instruments that enabled armies to fight with greater coordination over long distances. The 19th century was also a period of scientific advancement in understanding magnetism. Researchers such as Carl Friedrich Gauss and Alexander von Humboldt studied the Earth's magnetic field in greater detail, establishing observatories to measure its strength and variation. These studies improved the accuracy of navigation and helped develop better methods for correcting compass errors caused by local magnetic disturbances. In cities, the compass even found a place in everyday life. Pocket compasses became popular among travelers, hunters, and outdoor enthusiasts. Compact and affordable, they offered reassurance to anyone venturing beyond familiar streets and paths. For many, the small brass instrument became a symbol of exploration and self-reliance. As the century drew to a close, the compass had been refined into multiple specialized forms. Mariners used liquid-filled compasses that dampened the needle's movement in rough seas. Surveyors carried precision compasses mounted on tripods for accurate bearings. Soldiers used rugged, portable designs suited to the rigors of the field. Each variation reflected the needs of its user, but all relied on the same fundamental principle that had guided sailors for centuries: the quiet pull of the Earth's magnetic field, steady and invisible, always pointing the way. In the industrial age, the compass was more than a navigational tool. It was a constant presence in an era of unprecedented expansion, connecting the old rhythms of exploration to the new speed of steam, steel, and empire. Whether in the hands of a captain crossing an ocean, a surveyor mapping a frontier, or a soldier finding his way through unfamiliar country, It remained a silent partner in humanity's ongoing journey across the world. The 20th century opened with a world that was larger and yet more connected than ever before. Railways spanned continents, steamships crossed oceans with regularity, and telegraph lines carried messages between capitals in minutes. But even as new technologies emerged, the compass remained an essential tool for navigation on land, sea, and in the air. This was a century that would see exploration push into some of the most extreme environments on Earth. And it would also see two devastating world wars in which the ability to navigate quickly and accurately could mean the difference between survival and loss. At sea, the compass had by now been refined into highly reliable forms. Liquid-filled designs steadied the needle against the motion of the waves, and advanced binnacles housed compasses in protective casings with built-in correctors to account for magnetic deviation caused by the ship's structure. Navies relied on them for everything from plotting the courses of massive battleships to guiding small patrol vessels through fog and darkness. The compass was often used alongside newer instruments like the gyro compass, which, unaffected by magnetism, provided a true north reading based on the rotation of the Earth. Yet the magnetic compass still had a place, serving as a trusted backup in case of mechanical failure. In the First World War, military operations on land depended heavily on compasses. Soldiers used them to navigate trenches, forests, and battlefields shrouded in smoke. Artillery units relied on precise bearings to aim their guns at targets beyond direct sight. Scouts and reconnaissance teams carried compact, rugged designs that could withstand the mud and weather of the front lines. The compass was a quiet companion in a noisy, chaotic world, giving its users a sense of direction when all else seemed uncertain. The interwar years saw the compass take to the skies. Aviation was still young, but aircraft were already pushing the limits of speed and distance. Early pilots navigated using a combination of visual landmarks, maps, and magnetic compasses mounted in their cockpits. Flying over long stretches of water or unbroken terrain meant trusting the steady pull of the needle, especially when weather obscured the ground below. In 1927, Charles Lindbergh famously used a compass during his solo flight across the Atlantic, keeping a steady heading through long hours of isolation. The Second World War brought the compass into nearly every theater of combat. Naval fleets coordinated across vast oceans, aircraft flew missions over enemy territory, and ground forces advanced through deserts, mountains, and jungles where paths were often invisible. Special operations teams used compasses for covert movements under cover of night, guiding them to drop zones, rendezvous points, and escape routes. Even in an age when radio navigation aids were becoming more common, the compass remained a dependable standby, immune to signal jamming, requiring no power, and able to function in environments where more sophisticated equipment might fail. The compass was also part of the great exploratory ventures of the mid-20th century. Polar expeditions to the Arctic and Antarctic relied on them, though navigators in these regions had to contend with the distortion of readings near the magnetic poles. Mountaineers climbing the world's highest peaks carried compasses in their packs, using them to find safe routes when storms erased all visibility. Scientists mapping remote regions or conducting fieldwork far from settlements trusted the same simple instrument that had once guided caravans and sailing ships. By the close of the century's first half, the compass had traveled with humanity into every conceivable environment: oceans, skies, deserts, ice fields, and battlefields. Its design had been adapted for each, but its core principle remained the same: a needle aligning with the Earth's magnetic field, offering direction in the absence of landmarks. The world was moving toward new navigation systems: radio beacons, radar, and eventually satellites, but the compass held its place as the simplest, most reliable guide. Whether in the pocket of a soldier, mounted on the bridge of a destroyer, or fixed to the instrument panel of an airplane, it continued to point the way forward, just as it had for centuries. In the decades following the Second World War, the world entered a period defined by tension, technology, and transformation. The Cold War set superpowers against each other in a contest that spanned the globe, from the depths of the oceans to the edges of space. While new forms of navigation emerged, radio systems, inertial guidance, and eventually satellites, the magnetic compass remained in service, both as a trusted standby and as a tool uniquely immune to certain vulnerabilities of modern electronics. In the navies of the United States, the Soviet Union, and their allies. The compass worked alongside the gyro compass and radar to guide fleets across oceans during long deployments. Submarines, operating in the deep and often beyond the reach of radio signals, carried multiple navigation systems. Yet the magnetic compass was still part of their redundancy planning. It needed no power, could not be electronically jammed, and offered a silent, steady reference point in the vast, dark expanses under the sea. On land, armies adapted the compass for modern warfare. Soldiers in the Korean and Vietnam Wars relied on lightweight, rugged models, often stored in belt pouches, to navigate jungles, mountains, and unfamiliar terrain. Even as aerial reconnaissance and improved mapping offered more information, the compass remained vital for small units operating away from supply lines or in areas where visibility was reduced by foliage, fog, or night operations. In aviation, the post-war boom in commercial and military aircraft brought new navigation aids such as VOR beacons, LORAN systems, and eventually inertial navigation units. But the cockpit compass, often mounted prominently above the instrument panel, remained an essential backup. Pilots knew that in the event of electrical failure or equipment malfunction, the magnetic compass could still point them in the right direction, guiding them toward a heading until more advanced systems could be restored. The era also saw the compass find a place in the hands of scientists and adventurers, pushing into remote and extreme environments. During the International Geophysical Year of 1957 to 1958, expeditions to Antarctica carried both magnetic and gyro compasses, adjusting for the peculiarities of navigation near the poles, where magnetic readings could become erratic. Explorers in the Himalayas, researchers in the Amazon, and surveyors in the deserts of Africa all continued to use the compass as a simple, dependable link to the wider world. At the same time, advances in materials and manufacturing made compasses more precise and more affordable. Liquid damping became standard, reducing needle oscillation for quicker, more accurate readings. Lensatic compasses, with sighting lenses for taking precise bearings, became common in military and civilian use. Orienteering, a sport and training discipline based on navigating with a map and compass, grew in popularity, ensuring that even in an age of electronics, people continued to learn the skills of traditional navigation. By the late 20th century, satellite-based navigation systems like GPS were beginning to emerge, offering location fixes with unprecedented accuracy. Yet early GPS devices were large, expensive, and dependent on power sources. In contrast, the compass remained small, lightweight, and entirely self-sufficient. For many travelers, hikers, and sailors, it was the ultimate fallback, a piece of equipment that could not run out of batteries or lose a signal. The Cold War period also underscored the value of low-tech reliability in a high-tech world. In an age when electronic systems could be disrupted by jamming, interference, or even electromagnetic pulses, the compass was unaffected. This made it not just a tool of navigation, but a symbol of resilience, a reminder that some of the simplest technologies endure precisely because they are immune to many of the weaknesses of newer inventions. As the century drew toward its close, the compass had accompanied humanity into a world that was far more interconnected and technologically complex than the one in which it had been born. It had traveled with explorers, soldiers, sailors, pilots, and scientists through decades of rapid change, adapting quietly to new demands without losing its essential character. Even as satellites prepared to take on much of the work of navigation, the compass continued to point the way, steady, silent, and unshaken by the rush of history around it. The dawn of the 21st century brought with it a world where satellites circled above, smartphones rested in nearly every pocket, and the concept of being truly lost seemed, at least on the surface, to be fading away. Digital maps, voice-guided navigation, and instant route calculations had become everyday conveniences. Yet, quietly and without fanfare, the magnetic compass remained part of this new landscape, not as a relic of the past, but as a steady companion to the most advanced tools of modern navigation. Many smartphones themselves contained tiny magnetic sensors, digital compasses, that allowed mapping apps to orient the display to match the user's direction. These electronic compasses were built on the same basic principle that had guided sailors centuries ago, detecting the Earth's magnetic field to find north. But unlike their simple predecessors, they were integrated with accelerometers, GPS receivers, and gyroscopes, creating a layered system where each instrument confirmed and corrected the others. Still, anyone who had ever lost a phone signal in the mountains or watched their battery fade during a long trek knew that technology could fail. And when it did, the old-fashioned magnetic compass, small enough to hang from a lanyard or slip into a pocket, was still the one tool that needed no network, no power, and no updates to point the way. In outdoor communities, the compass remained central to training and safety. Hikers, mountaineers, and sailors continued to learn traditional map and compass navigation as a safeguard. Against electronic failures, orienteering clubs thrived in parks and forests, teaching newcomers the quiet satisfaction of finding their way, using nothing but a bearing and a trail. Survivalists and emergency planners kept the compass in their kits, knowing that in times of disaster, when infrastructure might be damaged or technology disrupted, it could still offer direction when nothing else could. The military, too, never abandoned it. While modern forces rely heavily on GPS and advanced mapping systems, soldiers around the world are still trained in compass navigation. In environments where GPS signals can be jammed or degraded, the magnetic compass remains immune to interference. It is as dependable in a remote desert or dense jungle as it is on an open plain, making it a crucial backup for operations in uncertain conditions. Scientific expeditions continued to carry it as well. Field researchers in archaeology, geology, and biology often worked far from reliable electricity, and while they might record coordinates with GPS, the compass offered quick orientation and could be used to align survey lines or map features without waiting for electronic devices to initialize. In some regions near the poles, where GPS accuracy can be affected and magnetic variation is extreme, specialized training ensured that even these challenges could be managed. In urban life, the compass even found renewed symbolic value. It became a popular motif in jewelry, tattoos, and art, representing direction, guidance, and a steady course through life. This cultural presence kept its image alive, even for those who rarely handled a physical one. Meanwhile, modern engineering refined the instrument further. High-quality compasses with global needles could work accurately anywhere on Earth, regardless of hemisphere. Liquid damping made readings faster and steadier, while luminous markings allowed for use at night. Compact, lightweight designs ensured they could be carried without burden, whether in a soldier's gear, a climber's pack, or a child's pocket. The digital age had not replaced the compass. Instead, it had folded it into a larger ecosystem of navigation tools. It stood as a bridge between the oldest and newest ways of finding one's way, a reminder that technology works best when it builds on what has come before, and that sometimes the simplest solutions endure because they are the hardest to break. As the century progressed, humanity continued to move faster, travel farther, and rely more deeply on invisible signals and algorithms. Yet somewhere in a pocket, a drawer, or a pack, a small instrument with a freely turning needle still waited, ready to align itself with the same magnetic field that had guided travelers for over 1,000 years, ready to point the way forward when all else failed. In the quiet moments before a journey begins, there is something reassuring about holding a compass in your hand. It does not hum or light up. It does not depend on batteries or satellites. It simply exists, its needle turning gently until it finds its place, aligning itself with a force older than any civilization. That small, steady movement is the echo of more than 1,000 years of human history, a history in which the compass has been a constant companion, guiding travelers across deserts, mountains, forests, and oceans, through storms and darkness, toward places both known and unknown. Its story is not just about invention, but about persistence. Born in ancient China as a curiosity of lodestone, it traveled slowly along the pathways of trade, finding its way to the hands of sailors in the Mediterranean, merchants along the Indian Ocean, and explorers who pushed beyond the maps of their time. It helped launch the voyages that connected continents for the first time, guided the fleets of empires, and brought the goods, ideas, and cultures of distant lands into contact. It survived changes in politics, in science, in technology, because its value was never tied to fashion or trend. It answered a fundamental human need: to know where we are and where we are going. The compass adapted with the centuries. Its design shifted from floating needles to dry cards, from simple wooden mounts to liquid-filled housings and precision bearings. It found a place in the pockets of soldiers, the kits of explorers, and eventually the circuitry of smartphones. It has traveled with climbers to the highest peaks, with submariners to the deepest oceans, with aviators across vast skies, and with wanderers down unmarked trails. And yet, despite its reach, it has never lost its simplicity. No matter how advanced the tools around it have become, the compass still speaks in the same language: a fixed point, a steady direction, a promise that there is a way forward. In the digital age, its role has changed but not diminished. Surrounded by devices that can calculate routes and measure distances with extraordinary precision, the compass remains the quiet fallback, the one tool that will always work when others fail. For those who venture far from cities, into wilderness or across seas, it is not an ornament but a lifeline. For those who never leave the pavement, it endures as a symbol, appearing in stories, in art, and even as a metaphor for staying true to one's own path. Its endurance lies in its independence. The magnetic field that guides it cannot be switched off, cannot be owned, cannot be corrupted. It is the same for every person, in every place, on every journey. In that way, the compass belongs to all of humanity, a shared inheritance from those who first noticed that a stone could point in a particular direction. Even now, in an age when we move faster and farther than ever before, when our maps are live and our routes recalculated in seconds, the compass reminds us that navigation is more than just arriving. It is about awareness, about orientation, about choosing a direction and following it with intention. The world will continue to change. New tools will come and some will fade. But the compass will remain, not because it is necessary for every journey, but because it represents something we still value: the certainty that there is always a way to find our bearings, even in the most uncertain of times. And so, as it has for centuries, the compass will sit quietly in pockets and packs, in the drawers of desks and the kits of travelers, waiting for the moment it is needed. The needle will turn, align, and point the way, just as it always has, offering its silent guidance to those who seek it, carrying forward a legacy as enduring as the Earth's magnetic pull itself. And now, our story comes to a gentle close. Before we drift into the next chapter, I would be so grateful if you could give this video a like and subscribe to the channel so we can keep sharing these quiet journeys together. Now, let us continue to the next story in our Boring History for Sleep series. Tonight, we slowly open the pages of the watchmakers of 17th century Geneva. In the early years of the 17th century, Geneva was a city of narrow streets and tall stone houses, its rooftops clustered along the banks of Lake Léman, with the Alps rising in the distance. The air carried the scent of wood smoke in winter and the faint tang of the lake in summer. Bells rang from the cathedral to mark the hours, their tones drifting across the water and echoing through the city's winding alleys. Time in those days was a sound more than a sight, a rhythm kept by church bells, public hourglasses, and the routines of daily life. The city was small compared to the great capitals of Europe, yet it held a place of importance. Geneva was a center of Protestant reform, a refuge for those who had fled religious conflict in France and other parts of the continent. Among these refugees were skilled artisans, goldsmiths, engravers, metalworkers, who brought with them not only their trade, but also a hunger to rebuild their lives in a place of relative safety. Many of them were Huguenots, French Protestants, who had escaped persecution. They arrived with their tools, their techniques, and their traditions, settling into workshops in Geneva's old quarters. Goldsmithing was one of the most esteemed crafts, requiring precision, patience, and a mastery of fine detail. For generations, it had been the work of those who created jewelry, ornate tableware, and delicate metal fittings. But in the 17th century, this craft began to take a new direction. In the cities of Germany and France, small mechanical timepieces were becoming fashionable among the wealthy, portable clocks and early watches that could be carried in a pocket or worn on a chain. These were not yet accurate by modern standards, but they represented a new way of marking time, one that was personal rather than public. Geneva's goldsmiths saw in this an opportunity. The skills required for fine metalwork, the shaping of tiny components, the engraving of intricate patterns, were not so different from those needed to craft a watch. Gradually, the city's artisans began to turn their attention from purely decorative objects to functional ones. blending beauty with precision. The transition was not immediate. In the early years, watchmaking in Geneva was still a small trade, practiced by a handful of craftsmen who learned from foreign masters or adapted existing designs. These early watches were prized more for their artistry than for their accuracy. Cases were made of gold or silver, sometimes adorned with enamel scenes or inlaid with precious stones. Dials were engraved with delicate numerals and patterns, their hands shaped like leaves or arrows. Inside, the mechanisms were simple but carefully finished, each gear and spring polished to catch the light. Geneva's location helped the craft to grow. The city was connected by trade routes to France, Italy, and the German states, and its political independence allowed it to serve as a neutral meeting place for merchants. Wealthy travelers passing through could order a custom timepiece from a local workshop, or purchase one already made to carry as both a practical tool and a mark of status. The city's reputation for skilled craftsmanship spread slowly, carried by word of mouth and by the watches themselves, which found their way into pockets and onto chains far from the shores of Lake Leman. The 17th century was also a time of change in how people thought about time itself. Mechanical clocks, increasingly common in towns and cities, divided the day into equal hours, replacing older systems tied to the movement of the sun. For those who could afford a watch, this precision offered a new kind of control over daily life. Appointments could be kept more exactly, journeys could be timed more closely, and the hours could be divided for work, rest, and worship with greater certainty. In Geneva, the watchmakers were not yet numerous, but they were already part of this shift. Working in modest workshops, often above their homes, they labored at benches lit by daylight from small windows, using files, saws, and drills to shape tiny parts. Every movement was deliberate, every cut and polish measured, for a mistake on such a small scale could ruin days of work. These were the early days of what would become a defining craft for the city. Geneva was not yet known across Europe as the capital of fine watchmaking, but the foundations were being laid, in the skills of its artisans, the precision of their tools, and the quiet ambition that ticked away in the heart of each new timepiece they made. As the 17th century advanced, Geneva's growing community of watchmakers began to realize that their craft needed structure if it was to flourish. The work they produced was delicate, complex, and highly valued, but without some form of regulation, quality could vary, and reputations could be easily damaged. The answer lay in the guild system, a tradition well established in European cities, where artisans of a particular trade organized themselves into associations to protect their interests, set standards, and train new members. In Geneva, the watchmakers formed their own guild, bringing together craftsmen who had once worked as independent goldsmiths or metalworkers and uniting them under a common identity. The guild was more than a professional association. It was a mark of trust. To be admitted, a watchmaker had to demonstrate skill, producing work that met the guild's standards of precision and artistry. Apprenticeships were established, often lasting several years, during which a young artisan would learn not only the techniques of shaping gears and assembling movements, but also the discipline and patience required for such meticulous labor. These apprenticeships were demanding. A master would oversee every step of the apprentice's work, from the filing of a tiny pinion to the engraving of a watch's case. Mistakes were expected, but each one was a lesson in care and attention. By the time an apprentice was ready to become a journeyman, he had spent thousands of hours at the bench, his eyes trained to see the smallest imperfections, his hands practiced in movements so fine that they seemed almost instinctive. The guild also acted as a safeguard for customers. It set rules for the materials that could be used, ensuring that cases were made of genuine gold or silver when claimed, that movements were of proven design, and that every watch left the workshop in proper working order. Faulty work was not only a reflection on the maker, but on the city itself, and the guild's reputation was tied to Geneva's emerging identity as a center for fine craftsmanship. With these structures in place, the quality of Geneva's watches began to rise, and with it, their fame. Merchants traveling through the city took note, ordering pieces to sell in markets as far away as London, Amsterdam, and Constantinople. Wealthy patrons commissioned custom designs, watches engraved with family crests, adorned with enamel portraits, or decorated with scenes from classical mythology. These were not mere timekeepers. They were works of art, symbols of status and refinement. The guild also fostered a spirit of innovation. Members shared ideas and techniques, experimenting with ways to make watches more accurate and more reliable. They studied improvements coming from other parts of Europe, adapting and refining them in their own workshops. Some focused on developing smaller, more portable watches, while others experimented with more complex mechanisms, adding features like repeating chimes or calendar functions. The growing sophistication of the craft meant that Geneva's watchmakers began to attract not just wealthy travelers, but also talented artisans from abroad. Skilled clockmakers from France, Germany, and Italy came to the city to work, bringing with them new methods and ideas. This exchange enriched the local tradition, blending influences into a style that was distinctively Genevan, precise, elegant, and finely finished. As their reputation grew, so too did their sense of identity. Watchmakers began to see themselves not simply as craftsmen, but as guardians of a specialized art, one that combined beauty and utility in equal measure. The ticking of their creations marked not only the hours, but also the city's progress toward becoming one of the most respected watchmaking centers in Europe. By the end of the century, Geneva's watches were being carried in the pockets and worn on the chains of noblemen, merchants, and scholars across the continent. They were passed down as heirlooms, treasured for their workmanship as much as for their function. And in the quiet workshops of the city, beneath the steady light of the windows, the masters continued their patient labor, knowing that each watch they completed was both a piece of the present and a promise to the future, a testament to the care, skill, and dedication that had built their craft. As the 17th century moved into its later decades, Geneva's watchmakers had not only secured a reputation for quality, but had begun to earn recognition for their ingenuity. The guild had established firm standards, ensuring that every piece leaving a workshop was both beautiful and dependable. Yet among the city's most skilled masters, there was a growing desire to do more than simply uphold tradition. They sought to refine the mechanics of timekeeping itself, to push the limits of accuracy, and to create pieces that were as technically impressive as they were aesthetically striking. The art of watchmaking had always been a delicate balance between form and function. A watch needed to be small enough to be carried comfortably, yet large enough to house the intricate mechanisms that measured the passage of hours and minutes. It had to be durable enough to withstand daily use, yet refined enough to be a symbol of sophistication. Geneva's artisans embraced this challenge, treating each watch as both a tool and a canvas. Mechanically, one of the greatest ambitions was to improve precision. Timekeeping in the early 17th century was still prone to small errors, with even the best watches drifting by several minutes each day. Geneva's craftsmen studied advances coming from England and the Netherlands, where innovations such as the balance spring were beginning to transform watch accuracy. The balance spring, a coiled strip of fine metal attached to the balance wheel, regulated its oscillations, providing a more consistent rhythm. Incorporating this component required delicate adjustment and exceptional skill, but once mastered, it greatly enhanced the performance of a watch. Adopting such techniques was no simple matter. Each workshop had its own style of construction, and integrating new ideas meant rethinking designs from the ground up. Geneva's watchmakers proved adept at this, blending foreign innovations with their own methods to produce timepieces that rivaled the best in Europe. The improvements were not only internal. Externally, the watches of Geneva became celebrated for their artistry. Cases were crafted in precious metals, often decorated with finely painted enamel scenes, landscapes, portraits, or allegorical figures, framed by engraved patterns or set with small jewels. Some dials were richly ornamented, while others displayed a restrained elegance, with clean numerals and slim hands that reflected the city's taste for refinement. The diversity of styles reflected the varied clientele Geneva served. Some patrons desired understated pieces for practical daily use. Others wanted bold displays of wealth and craftsmanship. For the latter, Geneva's artisans created elaborate showpieces, including watches with automaton figures that moved when the mechanism was wound, or cases with secret compartments that could hold miniature portraits or inscriptions. These creations were not mere novelties. They were demonstrations of mastery, proof that Geneva's watchmakers could blend mechanical complexity with imaginative design. The growing sophistication of the craft attracted commissions from across Europe. Nobility and wealthy merchants would send detailed requests, specifying the materials, style, and features they desired. Some ordered watches with multiple functions, known as complications, calendar displays, moon phase indicators, or striking mechanisms that chime the hours. Meeting these demands required not only skill, but also collaboration, as multiple specialists might work on a single watch, one crafting the case, another assembling the movement, another engraving the final details. Innovation was also driven by competition. While Geneva's guild ensured high standards, it also fostered a healthy rivalry among its members. Masters sought to distinguish themselves through their craftsmanship, their ability to incorporate new technologies, and their reputation for reliability. This atmosphere of ambition kept the city's watchmaking at the forefront, pushing artisans to perfect their techniques and explore new possibilities. By the century's end, Geneva was no longer simply a respected producer of fine watches. It was a recognized leader in horology, influencing trends across the continent. Its timepieces were symbols of precision and artistry, blending the advances of the scientific age with the enduring appeal of handcraft. And in the quiet workshops along the city's winding streets, the ticking of completed watches joined the steady rhythm of tools at work, a reminder that every second, every movement, and every detail mattered in the pursuit of perfection. The closing decades of the 17th century were a time of both opportunity and uncertainty for Geneva. The city stood as a small but influential republic, known for its independence, its role as a Protestant stronghold, and its growing reputation for skilled craftsmanship. Yet it was surrounded by powerful neighbors: France to the west, the Duchy of Savoy to the south, and various territories of the Holy Roman Empire to the north and east, each with their own political ambitions. Religious tensions still simmered across Europe, even after the most violent conflicts of the Reformation had passed. Geneva's status as a refuge for Protestant artisans, merchants, and intellectuals continued to shape its population, bringing in waves of skilled immigrants who contributed to the city's industries. For the watchmakers, this meant a steady influx of talent. Huguenot refugees from France, in particular, arrived with their own traditions of goldsmithing and clockmaking, further enriching the local craft. These newcomers often brought techniques and designs learned in Paris or Lyon, which blended with Geneva's own methods to create a distinctive hybrid style. Economically, the watch trade benefited from Geneva's strategic location. The city lay along important trade routes linking northern and southern Europe, allowing finished watches to be sent quickly to major markets. Merchants from Geneva established connections in cities such as Amsterdam, London, and Hamburg, ensuring that the city's products reached wealthy buyers eager for fashionable timepieces. Political uncertainty, however, was a constant concern. The expansionist policies of Louis XIV of France loomed over Geneva, and the city maintained careful diplomatic ties to preserve its independence. Watchmakers, though focused on their craft, were not immune to these pressures. Disruptions to trade could affect the supply of precious metals, specialized tools, or imported components needed for certain designs. In these years, the Watchmaking Guild played a critical role not just in maintaining quality, but in protecting the interests of its members during periods of instability. It could coordinate the purchase of materials, negotiate with merchants, and ensure that production standards remained high even when resources were limited. This organization helped Geneva's watchmakers weather the fluctuations of politics and commerce, keeping their work consistent and their reputation intact. Culturally, Geneva was experiencing a refinement of tastes that influenced the appearance of its watches. The city's elite, influenced by trends from Paris and other European capitals, began to favor more restrained and elegant designs. While richly decorated enamel cases were still in demand, there was also a growing market for simpler, more understated pieces that emphasized mechanical quality over ornamentation. The best watchmakers adapted to these shifts, producing a range of styles to suit different patrons. Some workshops specialized in elaborate commissions for foreign courts, while others focused on producing reliable, well-made watches for the prosperous middle class. Innovation continued quietly amid these changes. Geneva's artisans refined their use of the balance spring, experimented with smaller, thinner movements, and sought ways to make their watches more resistant to dust and moisture, an important consideration for timepieces meant to be carried daily. They also developed a greater variety of complications, adding calendar mechanisms, alarm functions, and striking systems that could chime the hours and quarters. By the end of the 17th century, Geneva's watchmaking industry had established a pattern that would endure for centuries, a blend of traditional craftsmanship, openness to innovation, and adaptability to changing markets and political climates. The city had become known not only as a place where fine watches were made, but as a community of artisans whose work reflected a balance of artistry, precision, and resilience. And so, in workshops tucked behind narrow streets and under sloping rooftops, the steady tick of watch movements continued to mark the passing hours, measured, deliberate, and untroubled by the shifting winds of history. As the 17th century gave way to the 18th, Geneva's watchmakers entered a period of steady growth and widening influence. The foundations laid by the guild, the skill of its masters, and the city's reputation for integrity and craftsmanship began to yield rewards far beyond the shores of Lake Léman. What had once been a local craft serving a regional clientele was becoming a trade with international reach, sending Geneva's timepieces into the hands of nobles, merchants, scholars, and explorers across Europe, and even to distant colonies overseas. The network of merchants who dealt in Geneva watches expanded steadily. Some were Genevans who had settled abroad, opening shops in major trading cities and acting as trusted intermediaries between the workshops at home and customers far away. Others were foreign traders who recognized the value of the city's work and took advantage of its growing prestige. Watches from Geneva could be found in the counting houses of Amsterdam, in the salons of Paris, in the merchant districts of London, and in the courts of Central Europe. Each piece carried not only the craftsmanship of its maker, but also the reputation of the city itself. This expansion brought new challenges. Watches had to survive long journeys overland and by sea, often through climates very different from the temperate air of Geneva. Humidity, heat, and rough handling could damage delicate mechanisms, so watchmakers began to experiment with ways to make their products more robust. Cases were sealed more carefully to keep out dust and moisture, and movements were built with sturdier pivots and improved lubrication to endure long use without servicing. Geneva's artisans also adapted their designs to the tastes of foreign markets. In France, ornate enamel decoration and miniature painted scenes remained popular, often featuring pastoral landscapes or allegorical figures. In England, there was a stronger preference for restrained elegance, with clean dials, bold numerals, and cases of polished gold or silver. In the courts of Eastern Europe, watches with elaborate cases set with jewels or engraved with coats of arms were commissioned as diplomatic gifts, each one a statement of prestige as much as a functional timekeeper. The guild continued to safeguard standards, ensuring that even as production increased, quality did not suffer. Apprenticeship remained the path into the craft, with young men spending years learning every stage of watchmaking, from filing the tiniest gears to assembling the complete movement and testing its accuracy. Masters were expected to train their successors with the same patience and rigor they had received, passing down not only skills, but also the values of precision and honesty that had made Geneva's name respected. As demand grew, specialization became more common. Some workshops focused on cases, mastering the art of engraving and enameling, while others concentrated on the mechanical movements, pushing the limits of accuracy and complexity. This division of labor allowed each craftsman to perfect his particular skill, and the finished watch was often the result of collaboration among several specialists. By the early years of the 18th century, Geneva was widely recognized as one of Europe's foremost watchmaking centers, rivaling and in some cases surpassing established traditions in Paris, Augsburg, and London. The city's success rested not on mass production, which was still centuries away, but on the careful, deliberate work of its artisans. Each piece a marriage of artistry and engineering. This reputation was not built overnight, nor was it the work of any single master. It was the collective achievement of generations, of refugees who had brought their skills, of locals who had nurtured the craft, and of merchants who had carried Geneva's watches into the wider world. The city's timepieces had become more than instruments for telling time. They were tokens of refinement, symbols of reliability, and, for many who owned them, reminders of a place where skill and care were valued above speed and volume. And so, in the workshops tucked behind the quiet facades of Geneva's narrow streets, the tick of the watchmaker's bench continued. The hands of the masters moved with the same precision as the gears they shaped, knowing that each watch they sent into the world would carry with it the silent heartbeat of Geneva's enduring craft. The early years of the 18th century marked a period when Geneva's watchmakers were no longer content with simply matching the standards of their European rivals. They began to set new ones. The craft had matured into a tradition that valued both technical innovation and artistic refinement. And in this balance lay Geneva's growing dominance. Customers were no longer satisfied with a watch that simply kept reasonable time. They sought pieces that were more accurate, more durable, and more expressive of personal taste. The masters of Geneva's workshops understood this and responded with a quiet but steady stream of advancements. One area of focus was improving the reliability of movements. The adoption of the balanced spring in the previous century had already transformed accuracy, but Geneva's watchmakers sought further refinements. They experimented with variations in the spring's curvature, with different alloys to improve elasticity, and with new methods of adjusting the regulator to maintain consistency over months of use. Each tiny improvement could shave seconds from daily error, a small but meaningful victory in the quest for precision. They also turned their attention to portability and comfort. Watches became slimmer and lighter, moving away from the bulky forms of earlier decades. This was achieved not by reducing quality, but by redesigning the layout of components and refining manufacturing techniques to produce smaller, more precise parts. Cases were engineered to protect these delicate mechanisms without adding unnecessary weight, and winding systems were improved to make daily maintenance easier for the owner. Aesthetic innovation kept pace with mechanical progress. Geneva's tradition of enamel artistry reached new heights during this period. Artisans perfected miniature painting techniques, applying intricate scenes onto watch cases and dials, using fine brushes and layers of colored enamel. These images ranged from pastoral landscapes to mythological figures, from portraits of loved ones to delicate floral patterns. Some were intended as personal mementos, others as public displays of taste and status. The quality of this work was such that Geneva watches became as much admired for their beauty as for their engineering. The demand for personalized timepieces grew, leading to more bespoke commissions. Patrons would sit with watchmakers and case decorators to specify every detail: the style of numerals, the shape of the hands, the choice of metal, the imagery for the case, and any special mechanical features they desired. These might include complications such as a repeater mechanism to chime the time on demand, a calendar display, or a moon phase indicator. Each commission was a collaboration between artisan and client, resulting in a watch that reflected both technical mastery and the owner's identity. Geneva's workshops also benefited from the city's openness to outside influence. Ideas flowed in from England, where innovations and escapements were being developed, from France, where fashion dictated new styles of case and dial, and from the German states, where clockmakers were advancing mechanical theory. Geneva's craftsmen absorbed these developments, adapting them to their own standards and sometimes improving upon them. The watchmaking guild continued to play a vital role, not only by enforcing quality, but by encouraging the exchange of knowledge. Journeymen returning from work in other cities brought fresh techniques, while visiting artisans contributed new perspectives. The result was a dynamic craft culture, one that respected tradition but was never static. This combination of innovation and artistry reinforced Geneva's standing in the eyes of international patrons. By the middle of the 18th century, the city's watches were sought after not only in Europe, but in trading centers as far afield as the Ottoman Empire, India, and China. Each exported watch carried with it the reputation of the city, a silent ambassador of Geneva's skill. And so, in the quiet rooms where the work was done, under the steady light falling through small paned windows, the watchmakers continued their patient labor. The tools they used had changed little in centuries, but the results of their work were evolving constantly, subtly, deliberately, each new watch an improvement upon the last. In every tick of the escapement, in every turn of the hands, there was the mark of Geneva's pursuit of perfection, a pursuit that would carry its craft deeper into the century and further into the world. As the 18th century advanced toward its later decades, Geneva's watchmakers found themselves in a world that was both more connected and more competitive than ever before. Trade routes stretched farther, and the appetite for fine timepieces remained strong, but other cities, London, Paris, and a rising number of watchmaking centers in Switzerland's Jura Mountains, were competing for the same discerning customers. To maintain their place at the top, Geneva's artisans leaned into the strengths that had brought them this far: uncompromising quality, quiet innovation, and the ability to adapt their artistry to changing tastes. International demand for Geneva watches remained high, but the nature of that demand was shifting. The grandeur and ornamentation that had been fashionable in earlier decades began to give way, at least among some buyers, to a preference for elegance and restraint. Influences from neoclassical design, inspired by ancient Greek and Roman art, favored symmetry, clean lines, and a certain measured beauty. Geneva's watchmakers adjusted accordingly, producing pieces where the artistry lay as much in proportion and precision as in lavish decoration. Yet there were still markets, particularly in royal courts and among the wealthy elite of Eastern Europe and the Ottoman Empire, where opulence was expected. For these clients, Geneva workshops continued to produce richly enameled cases, set with jewels and engraved with elaborate scenes. The skill lay in being able to serve both worlds: the restrained refinement of neoclassicism and the dazzling excess of courtly luxury. Mechanical refinement remained a constant pursuit. Watchmakers worked to improve escapements, the heart of the timekeeping mechanism, seeking designs that would minimize friction and wears while maintaining accuracy over long periods. They refined repeating mechanisms so that the chiming of hours and quarters was crisp and pleasant to the ear. They also developed slimmer, more compact movements, allowing for lighter watches that were comfortable to carry without sacrificing durability. This ability to innovate mechanically while preserving aesthetic appeal was one of the reasons Geneva continued to command respect. The city's watchmakers were also careful in managing their reputation. The guild enforced strict quality control, ensuring that only watches meeting its standards bore the name of Geneva. This prevented the market from being diluted by inferior imitations and reinforced the idea that a Geneva watch was a guarantee of excellence. It was a form of brand protection long before such concepts were formally recognized in commerce. Political and economic fluctuations tested the industry's resilience. Periods of instability in Europe could disrupt trade routes or depress luxury spending, but Geneva's diversified customer base helped mitigate these effects. By cultivating clients in multiple regions and maintaining strong relationships with merchant networks, the city avoided over-reliance on any single market. Skilled diplomacy on the part of Geneva's leaders preserved the city's independence, allowing its artisans to continue working without the disruptions that affected some neighboring states. Culturally, watchmaking had become an integral part of Geneva's identity. It was no longer just an industry, it was a defining feature of the city's reputation abroad. Visitors came not only to conduct business, but also to see the craft firsthand, to walk the narrow streets where the steady work of filing, engraving, and assembling went on behind modest facades. The sound of tiny hammers, the scrape of fine files, and the faint tick of completed movements were part of the city's daily rhythm. By the final decades of the 18th century, Geneva had successfully maintained its position at the forefront of watchmaking, despite the growing number of competitors. It had done so by holding fast to its standards while quietly evolving its style and technology. The watches that left the city carried with them more than the hours and minutes they measured. They carried the weight of tradition, the precision of patient hands, and the assurance that even in a changing world, Geneva's mastery of its craft remained as steady as the ticking of its finest movements. As the final years of the 18th century unfolded, the watchmakers of Geneva faced a world in upheaval. The French Revolution, which began in 1789, sent waves of political, social, and economic change far beyond the borders of France. Geneva, though formally independent, could not escape the shifting currents of the age. The city had long prided itself on its neutrality and its stability, qualities that had helped its artisans flourish. But revolutionary ideas and the pressures of the surrounding powers made that neutrality increasingly difficult to maintain. For the watchmakers, the most immediate challenge was uncertainty. The disruption of traditional trade routes, the instability of some client markets, and the changing political alignments of Europe all threatened the steady flow of orders. Yet the reputation of Geneva's watches, carefully built over generations, remained strong enough to carry the industry through the turbulence. Wealthy clients, whether aristocrats displaced by revolution or members of the new rising bourgeoisie, still valued the precision and craftsmanship that the city's artisans could provide. Even in uncertain times, the need for dependable, well-made timepieces did not vanish. In fact, some found that the reliability of a finely crafted watch provided a sense of stability in a chaotic world. The arrival of French troops in Geneva in 1798 marked a profound change. The city was annexed to France, and its independence was, for a time, erased. The guild system that had regulated and protected the watchmakers for centuries was dismantled under the new administration, which sought to align Geneva's institutions with French laws and economic policies. This could have been a devastating blow, as the guild had served as the guardian of quality and the arbiter of disputes within the trade. Yet the habits of quality and mutual support were so ingrained among Geneva's artisans that the standards endured, even without the formal structure of the guild. Workshop masters continued to train apprentices with care, to maintain precision in their movements, and to uphold the reputation of the city's name. The Napoleonic Wars, which raged across Europe in the first years of the 19th century, posed additional challenges. Continental blockades and the redirection of resources toward military needs affected trade, but they also created new opportunities. Officers and dignitaries across the continent sought reliable watches, both for personal use and as gifts or symbols of rank. Some Geneva watchmakers began producing specially commissioned timepieces for military figures, incorporating robust designs and practical features suited to the demands of campaigning life. Others found ways to navigate the restrictions of wartime trade, relying on discrete networks of merchants and couriers to reach clients in neutral territories or even across enemy lines. Throughout this period, the watchmakers demonstrated a quiet adaptability. They experimented with new designs that reflected the tastes of the Napoleonic era, blending neoclassical elegance with subtle nods to martial themes. Cases might be engraved with laurel wreaths or the profiles of notable leaders, while dials retained the clarity and precision for which Geneva was known. Mechanically, the focus remained on reliability, as the uncertain conditions of the time placed a premium on watches that could withstand travel, varied climates, and long periods without servicing. By the time the Napoleonic era came to an end in 1815, Geneva had weathered more than 2 decades of upheaval. The Congress of Vienna restored its independence, and with it came a renewed sense of civic pride. The watchmaking industry emerged not diminished, but in some ways strengthened by its experience. It had proven that the skills, discipline, and reputation of Geneva's artisans could endure even when the political structures that had supported them were swept away. The workshops continued their work much as they had before, but with a deeper awareness that the world beyond their city walls could change suddenly and without warning. This understanding lent their craft a quiet resilience, a recognition that the precision of a movement and the beauty of a case were not just luxuries, but enduring achievements in a world where so much else was uncertain. In the tick of a Geneva watch, there was constancy, an unbroken link to the generations of steady hands and focused minds that had shaped the city's place in history, and a reminder that even in times of great change, the measure of time itself continued without haste or pause. The early decades of the 19th century brought with them a quiet but profound transformation in the way the world worked. In many parts of Europe and across the Atlantic in America, machines were beginning to take over tasks that had once been done entirely by hand. In Britain, factories driven by steam power had already revolutionized the textile trade, and the same principles were slowly making their way into other industries. For the watchmakers of Geneva, whose craft had always been rooted in meticulous manual skill, the industrial age presented both a challenge and an opportunity. In the Jura Mountains of Switzerland and in American cities like Waltham and Springfield, mechanized production methods were being introduced to the manufacture of watches. Precision machinery, designed to produce identical parts at scale, promised to make timepieces more affordable and accessible to a growing middle class. Standardized components meant that watches could be assembled more quickly, repaired more easily, and sold at prices far lower than those of the handmade models of Geneva. The implications were clear. While Geneva's workshops could continue to cater to the wealthy and to connoisseurs, they could no longer expect to dominate the market for all watches. The city's artisans watched these developments with cautious interest. Some saw in the new machinery a threat to their traditions, fearing that the artistry of hand-finished movements and cases would be diminished in a world that valued speed and uniformity. Others saw possibilities. By incorporating certain mechanized processes for basic tasks, such as cutting gears or milling plates, They could save time and focus more of their attention on the delicate adjustments and fine finishing that gave a Geneva watch its distinctive character. Gradually, some of the larger workshops began to blend old and new methods. Machines might shape the rough components, but skilled hands still assembled, regulated, and decorated the movements. The dials continued to bear elegant enamel work, the cases fine engraving or guilloche patterns, and the overall quality remained unmistakably in line with the traditions of the city. The industrialization of watchmaking also altered the geography of the trade. Villages in the Jura and elsewhere in Switzerland became centers for producing parts, which could then be sent to Geneva for final assembly and finishing. This networked approach allowed Geneva to maintain its role as the hallmark of excellence, even as other regions took on more of the mass production tasks. The city's name became a kind of guarantee, a mark that the watch, regardless of where its raw components had been made, had been completed under the watchful eye of Geneva's master craftsmen. International exhibitions, which became increasingly popular in the 19th century, provided an important stage for Geneva watchmakers to demonstrate that their work could stand alongside the best the industrial world had to offer. At fairs in Paris, London, and beyond, their displays emphasized both technical innovation and aesthetic refinement. Complicated watches, featuring minute repeaters, perpetual calendars, and chronographs, showed that Geneva could not only preserve tradition, but also push the boundaries of horological science. By doing so, they carved out a niche that mass production could not easily reach, a space where artistry, innovation, and precision met in equal measure. Yet the shift to a more mechanized world was not without its costs. Smaller workshops, unable or unwilling to adapt, found it harder to compete. Some closed, while others were absorbed into larger firms. Apprenticeship traditions, while still alive, began to change in character, with young watchmakers learning not only the classic techniques, but also how to operate and maintain the new machines that were becoming part of the trade. Through it all, Geneva's watchmakers retained a clear sense of identity. They understood that their survival depended on balancing the efficiency of the new with the integrity of the old. While the industrial age reshaped the global watch market, it also reinforced Geneva's role as the custodian of fine watchmaking. The city became a place where precision was not merely measured in fractions of a second, but in the generations of skill that had been passed down, refined, and adapted to meet the demands of changing times. In this way, Geneva entered the modern era not as a relic of the past, but as a living bridge between centuries of tradition and the technological ambitions of the future. As the 20th century approached, Geneva's watchmakers found themselves on the threshold of another period of transformation. The Industrial Revolution had already redrawn the map of global manufacturing, and now advances in transportation, communication, and marketing were beginning to reshape how watches were made, sold, and valued. Railways and steamships carried goods faster than ever before, allowing Geneva's timepieces to reach markets in Asia, the Americas, and Africa with unprecedented speed. Telegraph lines and later the telephone connected merchants and clients across continents, making it possible to negotiate orders, arrange shipments, and respond to demands without the long delays of correspondence by mail. At the same time, the world was entering an age of branding. In earlier centuries, a watch's worth was judged primarily by the name of its maker, often a single craftsman or a small workshop. By the dawn of the 20th century, larger firms began to see the potential of building a recognizable brand identity, one that could convey prestige, reliability, and exclusivity to buyers who might never set foot in Switzerland. The hallmark Geneva was itself a powerful selling point, but now companies were investing in advertising, creating distinctive logos, and showcasing their creations at international exhibitions. Luxury became not only a matter of quality, but of perception, and Geneva's watchmakers proved adept at cultivating both. The shift toward branding also encouraged the development of flagship models, timepieces designed not just as functional tools, but as symbols of refinement and status. This period saw the introduction of watches with complex complications: moon phase indicators, perpetual calendars, split-second chronographs. These were often displayed in elaborately decorated cases, merging the technical precision of the movement with the artistic beauty of the exterior. Customers from Paris to New York sought out these masterpieces, and owning one was considered a mark of discernment and sophistication. Yet the challenges continued to mount. The rise of American watch factories capable of producing reliable watches in vast numbers, threatened to erode Geneva's dominance in everyday timekeeping. The answer, for many Genevan firms, was to retreat further into the realm of high horology, watches that justified their price not by being the cheapest or the most widely available, but by being the finest examples of the watchmaker's art. They focused on small production runs, each piece assembled and finished with the same care that had defined the city's tradition for centuries. The 20th century also brought with it new materials and techniques. Advances in metallurgy led to stronger and more precise springs and gears. Synthetic jewels replaced natural ones in many watch movements, reducing friction and increasing durability. Improved enameling and engraving methods enhanced the beauty of watch dials and cases, while better regulation devices allowed for even more accurate timekeeping. Geneva's workshops were quick to integrate these innovations, but always in ways that complemented rather than replaced the human touch. The first decades of the century were not without turbulence. World War I disrupted supply lines and markets, forcing many watchmakers to shift production toward military needs. Wristwatches, which had been relatively uncommon before the war, became indispensable for soldiers, leading to a surge in their popularity afterward. Geneva's watchmakers adapted, producing wristwatches with the same care they had once lavished on pocket watches, often incorporating luminous dials and rugged cases suited for the new demands of modern life. By the 1920s and 1930s, Geneva had firmly established itself as the global capital of fine watchmaking. It was a city where tradition and innovation lived side by side, where the hum of machinery in one room blended with the quiet concentration of a craftsman polishing a bridge or hand-painting an enamel dial in another. Visitors could walk along its narrow streets and hear the soft ticking of countless timepieces in progress, each destined to carry the name of Geneva to some far-off corner of the world. The story of Geneva's watchmakers was no longer just about a local craft. It had become part of a global narrative, one that would continue to evolve through wars, economic upheavals, and technological revolutions. Yet through it all, the essence remained unchanged. The belief that a watch was more than a device to measure hours and minutes. It was a statement of skill, patience, and artistry, a legacy built over centuries, still beating steadily in the heart of a city by the lake. That brings us to the end of our previous story. Before we begin the next one, I'd be grateful if you could give this channel a like and a subscription. It truly helps us continue sharing these journeys through the quieter corners of history. And now, let us gently move on to the next chapter in our Boring History for Sleep series, as we uncover how ancient pottery revealed lost stories. Under the soft glow of museum lights, rows of clay vessels sat in quiet stillness, their surfaces dulled by centuries, but still holding the faint traces of hands that shaped them long ago. Each curve, each mark, each imperfection was a whisper from a distant world, a message left not in words but in form and texture. Ancient pottery, at first glance, can seem like nothing more than a practical object, a container for grain, water, oil, or wine. Yet for those who study them patiently, they are something far greater, a form of storytelling that survived when parchment crumbled and voices faded into silence. Long before ink met paper, before typewriters or digital screens, communities told their stories through the things they made and used. Pottery was one of the most enduring of these mediums. It was shaped from earth, hardened by fire, and destined to outlast wood, cloth, and bone. While entire cities could vanish beneath shifting sands or thick forests, these humble vessels often remained, sometimes broken into shards, sometimes intact, waiting for a new set of hands to find them and read what was hidden in their form. Archaeologists, in their slow and careful work, treat these fragments as clues in a larger puzzle. A simple bowl might reveal where a people found their clay, how they processed it, the temperatures their kilns could reach, and even what they ate or drank. Decorative patterns can show trade connections, as a motif found in one region may match another thousands of miles away, proving that ideas traveled far earlier than we might assume. Even the wear on the rim of a cup, or the soot marks on the base of a cooking pot, can tell us how it was used and how often. These details, once pieced together, create a picture of lives lived in the shadow of history, lives that otherwise might have been forgotten. The story of pottery is also the story of human adaptation. Across different cultures and centuries, people shaped clay according to their needs, environments, and beliefs. In some places, the vessels were plain, built only for function. In others, they were decorated with intricate designs, painted with images of gods, animals, or daily life. Sometimes they were buried in tombs alongside the dead, serving as offerings or provisions for the afterlife. Other times, they were traded across seas, becoming the first ambassadors of a culture to foreign shores. In ancient Greece, for example, large amphorae carried wine and olive oil across the Mediterranean, their stamped seals guaranteeing origin and quality. In China, porcelain and fine stoneware traveled along the Silk Road, prized for their beauty and durability. In the Americas, pottery of the ancestral Puebloans carried the geometric patterns of their worldview, preserved in clay even as their cities fell silent. Each of these traditions, while distinct, was connected by the same human impulse to create objects that were both useful and meaningful. What makes ancient pottery especially powerful as a historical record is that it often survives where written language does not. Fires can consume manuscripts, floods can dissolve ink, and languages themselves can fade from memory. But a shard of fired clay can endure for millennia, carrying with it the fingerprints of its maker, preserved beneath layers of glaze or slip. For historians, these are not just remnants of craft. They are pieces of a long conversation between the past and the present. When we look at them today, we are seeing what someone centuries ago once saw, holding in our hands what they once held in theirs. Imagine a potter in a small village, thousands of years ago, working at a wheel or shaping clay by hand. Perhaps a child plays nearby, watching as the vessel takes form. Perhaps the potter hums a song known only in that community, or pauses to smooth the surface with a stone passed down from an elder. When the piece is finished and placed in the kiln, there is no thought that it will one day sit behind glass, studied by strangers. It is simply part of the rhythm of life. And yet, through some twist of fate, that vessel survives. The village is abandoned, the fields grow wild, the people move on, but the pot remains, waiting for the moment when it will be found again. This is the quiet magic of ancient pottery. It turns the ordinary into the extraordinary, simply by enduring. In that endurance, it carries the lost stories of the people who made it, used it, and left it behind. These stories may not be told in words, but they can be read in the weight of the clay, the balance of the form, and the care taken in its creation. And so, as we begin this journey into the world of ancient pottery, we step into a realm where history is not written on paper, but pressed into the very fabric of the earth, where the simplest of objects can speak across centuries, telling us who we were, how we lived, and perhaps, in small ways, why we still shape and hold the things we do. In examining ancient pottery, scholars often find themselves tracing not just the evolution of craftsmanship, but also the migration of entire cultures. For clay, unlike more perishable materials, records a journey in its very structure. The minerals embedded in the fabric of a pot can tell scientists where the raw material was quarried, revealing trade networks that stretch across mountains, deserts, and seas. A single vessel might contain clay from one region, temper from another, and stylistic elements borrowed from yet another, suggesting a world far more interconnected than our school textbooks once suggested. This level of detail emerges from meticulous analysis, microscopic study of mineral grains, chemical fingerprinting of the clay, and even residue testing of the contents once held inside. By recreating ancient recipes for pottery glazes, modern artisans and archaeologists alike have uncovered the technological sophistication of these early communities. Many glazes required precise temperature control, knowledge of mineral properties, and an understanding of how colors would change after firing, skills that speak of accumulated knowledge passed down through generations. Some cultures developed specialized kilns capable of reaching temperatures high enough to create remarkably durable ceramics, while others perfected decorative techniques like slip painting, incising, or burnishing that could withstand centuries of burial without losing their vibrancy. Pottery shards, often overlooked by casual observers, have also been instrumental in dating archaeological sites. Styles of decoration, vessel shapes, and manufacturing techniques evolved gradually over time, creating a sort of chronological code for researchers. By comparing shards from one site to those in a well-dated location, archaeologists can approximate when a settlement was occupied, even in the absence of written records. This method, known as ceramic typology, has been particularly vital in regions where historical texts are scarce or non-existent. But beyond the technical data, Pottery offers something intangible yet deeply human: glimpses of daily life. A jar with scorch marks tells of cooking fires and family meals. A cracked water jug repaired with care reveals a society where resources were valued enough to mend rather than discard. Decorative motifs might depict harvest scenes, religious rituals, or mythical creatures, each a window into the beliefs and priorities of the culture that produced them. Even fingerprints pressed into the clay, perhaps accidentally by a hurried artisan, bring an immediacy to these objects that is hard to match with stone monuments or royal inscriptions. In many cases, pottery has preserved stories of cultural contact and exchange. For example, Greek amphorae have been found in Celtic territories, their painted scenes introducing foreign myths and iconography to distant lands. Similarly, Roman red gloss ware, known as terra sigillata, was distributed so widely that it became a marker of Roman influence, even in provinces where the empire's presence was otherwise minimal. These wares often imitated earlier local forms, blending imported aesthetics with indigenous traditions, a tangible reflection of how cultures adapted to each other. In East Asia, the development of porcelain, an achievement requiring extraordinary mastery of firing techniques, set off centuries of trade, influencing everything from Persian ceramics to Dutch Delftware. The sheer desirability of these goods sparked entire industries dedicated to imitation, underscoring how pottery could shape not only artistic expression, but also economies and political relationships. Pottery also played a role in ritual and symbolic life. In some societies, vessels were created specifically for burial, their forms and decorations meant to serve the deceased in the afterlife, or to convey status in death as in life. Others were used in ceremonial feasts or as offerings to deities, their destruction afterward marking the conclusion of a sacred event. These practices left behind rich deposits of broken pottery, middens that to modern archaeologists are archives of belief, celebration, and mourning. What emerges from all of this is the understanding that pottery was not simply utilitarian. It was an intersection of art, technology, commerce, and spirituality, bound together in an object humble enough to fit in the palm of a hand, yet significant enough to carry meaning across centuries. When we hold a fragment today, we are not merely touching clay. We are making contact with choices, skills, and values that defined entire communities. The potter's wheel, the brush loaded with slip, the heat of the kiln, these were tools of both necessity and self-expression. And while the hands that shaped them have long since turned to dust, the vessels endure, their stories intact for those patient enough to listen. In this way, ancient pottery becomes more than an artifact. It is a bridge, one that connects the scattered islands of human history into a single, continuous shoreline, reminding us that even the quietest remnants can speak volumes if we learn to read their language. As the study of ancient pottery deepened over the past century, archaeologists began to realize that these fragments were not only physical remnants, but also data points in a vast network of human interaction. The soil layers in which pottery is found often reveal as much about the object as the object itself. A shard buried beneath layers of ash might hint at a sudden volcanic eruption, like those that preserved entire Roman towns under meters of pumice. Pottery found in river sediments may tell of seasonal flooding that altered trade routes or destroyed settlements, forcing communities to rebuild elsewhere. Even the way pottery is discarded can speak volumes. Some sites contain refuse pits filled with broken vessels, suggesting communal feasts or mass production workshops, while other areas show deliberate burial of pots, perhaps as offerings to secure good harvests or safe journeys. The chemical composition of glazes and pigments has become an invaluable tool for tracing the movement of goods and ideas. Through techniques like X-ray fluorescence and neutron activation analysis, researchers can identify the geological origins of materials used in pottery production. This means that a small cup unearthed in a North African port might be definitively linked to clay beds in the Italian peninsula, proving trade connections that written sources never mention. Such discoveries reshape our understanding of ancient economies, revealing that some civilizations were far more interconnected and reliant on distant resources than we once believed. Pottery also sheds light on technological innovation. The transition from hand-molded pottery to wheel-thrown vessels marked a revolution in production speed and uniformity. Wheel-thrown pottery allowed artisans to create thinner walls, more symmetrical forms, and standard sizes, which in turn facilitated mass storage and transport. The introduction of high-temperature kilns expanded the range of usable clays and glazes, leading to more durable and aesthetically varied products. This technological leap was not confined to one culture. It spread along trade routes, adapted by each region to suit local tastes and resources. Decorative techniques evolved in parallel with these technological changes. Early designs were often simple geometric patterns etched or painted before firing, but over time, motifs became more complex, incorporating narrative scenes, floral elements, and symbolic imagery. The colors themselves could carry meaning. Red slips might signify vitality or protection, while black glazed wares were often associated with prestige or ritual. Some cultures used pottery decoration to assert identity, marking vessels with clan symbols or distinctive styles that signaled origin and craftsmanship to traders and buyers. Beyond the visible surface, residue analysis has offered surprising glimpses into ancient diets and trade in perishable goods. Traces of olive oil, wine, honey, grains, and even exotic spices have been identified in the pores of ancient pots. In some cases, these findings have confirmed long-suspected trade links. In others, they have revealed entirely new ones. The discovery of Southeast Asian spices in Mediterranean amphorae, for instance, underscores the vast distances that goods traveled, carried by merchants who likely never met the farmers who grew them. The social role of pottery is equally revealing. In many ancient cities, potters' workshops formed important economic hubs, sometimes operating as family businesses for generations. Apprentices learned not only technical skills, but also the artistic traditions and market preferences of their communities. Some master potters gained renown across regions, their signatures or makers' marks sought after like luxury brands today. In this way, pottery production reflects a blend of artistry, commerce, and social standing. Religious and ceremonial uses of pottery also provide rich insight into belief systems. In some ancient temples, specialized vessels were made solely for libations or offerings, often adorned with symbols meant to invoke divine favor. The deliberate breaking of these vessels at the end of rituals suggests a symbolic release of their purpose, turning them into sacred refuse. Archaeologists studying such deposits can reconstruct patterns of worship, feast cycles, and even shifts in religious focus over time. Pottery's resilience has also made it a witness to cultural change. When a dominant empire collapsed, local pottery styles often shifted rapidly, sometimes incorporating elements from the conquerors, other times reviving older traditions as a form of cultural resistance. These shifts in style, technique, and distribution patterns serve as a silent record of political upheaval, migration, and adaptation. Ultimately, what makes pottery so powerful as a historical source is its dual nature. It is both ordinary and extraordinary. A simple storage jar might have been touched daily by an ancient family, yet its survival allows it to carry forward details about trade, technology, art, and belief that might otherwise be lost. Holding such a fragment today, one is reminded that the past is not entirely gone. It remains embedded in the durable, unassuming objects that once fit seamlessly into the rhythm of life. Pottery, in its quiet endurance, becomes a kind of time capsule, preserving the fingerprints, choices, and connections of people whose voices we can no longer hear, but whose presence we can still feel through the clay they shaped. By the time pottery-making techniques reached their peak in several ancient civilizations, these humble vessels had already become more than just utilitarian tools. They were mirrors reflecting the complexities of human society. The variety of shapes, sizes, and finishes was not random. It often corresponded to the specific needs of different communities, the resources available to them, and the cultural values they held dear. For example, in agrarian societies dependent on grain storage, large, thick-walled jars with narrow necks were favored to keep pests and moisture out. In coastal fishing villages, shallower bowls and flat platters dominated, designed for drying fish or preparing seafood-based stews. This interplay between environment and design created an astonishing range of pottery forms, each adapted to a way of life and a set of priorities. Equally fascinating is how pottery reveals patterns of settlement and interaction between cultures. Excavations in border regions often yield hybrid designs, vessels that blend the shapes and decorative styles of two or more distinct traditions. Such artifacts point to the movement of artisans, intermarriage between communities, or trade agreements that brought foreign goods and ideas into local markets. In some cases, these hybrids became the dominant style in a region, suggesting a merging of cultural identities over time. The process of making pottery was itself a communal activity in many societies, with certain stages, like gathering clay or firing large communal kilns, requiring the labor and cooperation of multiple people. These shared efforts strengthened social bonds and created opportunities for the transmission of skills and stories across generations. Even the locations of kilns and clay pits can reveal much about ancient economies and settlement planning. Sites with evidence of specialized production often indicate the presence of a central authority or market system capable of coordinating supply and demand on a large scale. The role of pottery in trade cannot be overstated. Long before the invention of barrels or modern containers, pottery was the primary means of transporting goods across land and sea. Amphorae filled with wine, oil, or grain were loaded onto ships and carried to distant markets, their standardized shapes allowing them to be stacked efficiently in cargo holds. Pottery stamps and painted inscriptions recorded the origin, contents, and sometimes even the name of the merchant, functioning much like shipping labels today. These markings have become invaluable to archaeologists for reconstructing ancient trade networks and understanding the flow of goods, wealth, and influence between regions. In some cultures, pottery even played a role in legal and political life. In ancient Athens, for example, small shards of broken pottery, called ostraka, were inscribed with the names of individuals to be exiled from the city for a decade. This practice, known as ostracism, served as a democratic safeguard against potential tyrants, and it is thanks to the survival of these pottery fragments that we know the names of both the powerful and the unpopular in Athenian politics. Religious and ceremonial uses of pottery further highlight its symbolic importance. In many ancient burial practices, pots were included in tombs, sometimes containing food and drink for the deceased in the afterlife, other times serving as urns for cremated remains. The decoration and craftsmanship of such pieces were often more elaborate than everyday wares, reflecting the care and reverence with which they were made. Pottery also played a role in seasonal festivals, with special vessels produced only for certain rituals, their forms and motifs tied to the myths and beliefs celebrated on those occasions. Artistic expression found a natural canvas in pottery, where form and function blended seamlessly. The curvature of a jar could guide the placement of a painted scene, and the choice of slip or glaze could enhance both durability and beauty. Storytelling through pottery decoration became a hallmark of several ancient cultures. Greek black figure and red figure pottery, for instance, captured scenes from mythology, daily life, and historical events with remarkable detail and style. Such imagery not only served as decoration, but also as a means of cultural transmission, preserving narratives for both contemporary audiences and future generations. Advances in archaeological science have added yet another dimension to the study of pottery. Microscopic analysis of wear patterns can reveal how a vessel was used, whether it was stirred often, subjected to heat, or sealed tightly for storage. Organic residue analysis can detect traces of foodstuffs, resins, or pigments, offering a tangible link to ancient diets and economies. Even the alignment of mineral crystals within a shard can reveal the firing temperature and atmosphere, shedding light on the technological capabilities of its makers. All these layers of meaning make pottery an unparalleled resource for understanding the past. Unlike perishable goods, it survives the centuries with minimal decay, holding within it a wealth of information about trade, technology, art, religion, and daily life. Each fragment, no matter how small, is a clue in a much larger puzzle, one that spans continents and millennia. In studying these artifacts, we not only reconstruct the practical realities of ancient life, but also glimpse the aspirations, values, and creativity of the people who shaped them. It is this combination of the ordinary and the extraordinary that makes pottery one of history's most eloquent storytellers. By the time pottery had firmly established itself as one of humanity's most enduring technologies, it had evolved far beyond its earliest, purely functional forms. In many ancient societies, pottery was as much a medium for communication as it was a tool for storage or cooking. The surface of a vessel could serve as a record, with decorative motifs, inscriptions, or symbolic imagery that conveyed messages understood by the local community. These could range from simple patterns indicating the maker's workshop to elaborate visual narratives depicting religious myths, historical victories, or even satirical commentary on everyday life. In places such as ancient Greece, the pot itself could become a stage for entire mythological dramas, with heroes, gods, and mortals captured in mid-action along the curved surface. The technological sophistication of pottery making during the height of ancient civilizations was remarkable. Potters had mastered techniques like wheel throwing, slip painting, glazing, and multi-stage firing to produce wares that were not only functional but also aesthetically refined. In regions like China during the Tang and Song dynasties, the production of high-fired porcelain became a major cultural and economic achievement, with the distinctive white, translucent material becoming highly prized both domestically and abroad. Similarly, in the Middle East, the development of tin-glazed ceramics allowed artisans to achieve vivid, lasting colors that were previously impossible with traditional clay slips. Each technological advance opened new possibilities for design and expression, and with these advances came a greater demand for skilled artisans. Pottery workshops in major urban centers often operated as organized enterprises, with divisions of labor that included clay preparers, wheel operators, decorators, and kiln managers. In some cases, these workshops functioned under state oversight or were patronized by wealthy elites who commissioned special pieces for political gifting or religious ceremonies. The economic value of pottery meant that certain styles or markings could function almost like brand names, signaling quality and authenticity in distant markets. Pottery also played a central role in cultural exchange. As trade routes expanded, whether along the Silk Road, across the Mediterranean, or through riverine networks in Africa, pottery styles and techniques traveled with merchants and migrants. Archaeologists have found foreign pottery in unexpected places, such as Mediterranean amphorae in ancient Britain or Chinese porcelain shards in East African coastal settlements, testifying to the breadth of ancient commercial and cultural contact. In some cases, foreign pottery was not merely imported for use, but also copied locally, sometimes with faithful accuracy and sometimes blended with local traditions to create entirely new hybrid forms. The spread of pottery styles also influenced cuisine and dining customs. A society that adopted imported amphorae for wine storage might begin integrating wine into social rituals, just as communities that acquired specialized cooking pots from traders might experiment with new food preparation methods. This interplay between vessel and foodway demonstrates how material culture could directly shape intangible cultural practices. Beyond trade and art, pottery had profound implications for archaeology as a scientific discipline. Because pottery is so durable and changes stylistically over time, it is one of the most important tools for dating archaeological sites. Typological analysis, classifying pottery into chronological sequences based on shape, decoration, and manufacturing technique, has allowed archaeologists to reconstruct timelines for entire civilizations. In some cases, changes in pottery styles correspond so closely with historical events, such as invasions, regime changes, or religious reforms, that the pottery record becomes a parallel historical chronicle. Another remarkable aspect of pottery is its ability to preserve tiny, often invisible traces of the past. Residue analysis has revealed astonishing details about ancient diets, trade goods, and even medicinal practices. Traces of cacao found in pottery vessels from Central America have pushed back the known history of chocolate consumption by centuries. Similarly, residues of fermented beverages in Chinese pottery have provided evidence of beer-making traditions thousands of years old. Such findings turn humble pots into vessels of extraordinary knowledge, bridging the gap between daily life and the broader sweep of history. The symbolic power of pottery was also recognized in ritual contexts. In many cultures, pottery vessels were deliberately broken during funerals, religious rites, or political events. This act could symbolize the end of a cycle, the release of a spirit, or the sealing of a pact. Archaeological sites with layers of deliberately smashed pottery suggest that these events were both communal and highly charged with meaning. The fragments themselves, or sherds, could be repurposed, sometimes as building material, sometimes as informal writing surfaces for notes, lists, or messages. Even in its broken state, pottery continued to serve practical and symbolic roles. All of this underscores the dual nature of pottery, as both an everyday tool and a profound cultural artifact. To handle an ancient pot, whether intact or in shards, is to connect with the hands that shaped it, the community that used it, and the world in which it circulated. It is this combination of resilience, adaptability, and communicative power that makes pottery one of the richest sources for understanding human history. Every surviving vessel, no matter how plain or ornate, carries within it the capacity to tell a story, not just of its own making, but of the people, places, and ideas that gave it life. By the later centuries of antiquity and into the medieval period, pottery continued to evolve, reflecting shifts in politics, religion, and commerce. In regions where centralized states rose and fell, pottery styles often mirrored the fortunes of those in power. The fall of Rome, for instance, disrupted long-established trade networks that had carried fine wares like terra sigillata across Europe, leading to a decline in mass-produced standardized ceramics and a return to more localized, often rougher pottery traditions. Yet even in these so-called dark ages, the knowledge of clay preparation, firing, and decoration did not disappear entirely. It adapted. In rural communities, simpler forms dominated, but the essential techniques remained, passed from one generation to the next, ensuring that the cultural memory embedded in pottery making survived periods of upheaval. In the Islamic world, pottery making reached new heights of sophistication, driven in part by a religious prohibition on precious metal vessels for eating and drinking. This encouraged artisans to elevate ceramics to an art form worthy of the tables of caliphs and sultans. Techniques such as lusterware, which created a shimmering metallic effect on the surface of the pot, were developed and refined in centers like Samarra, Kashan, and later in Spain under Moorish influence. These wares were not only beautiful, but also symbols of technological mastery, requiring precise control of kiln atmosphere and temperature over multiple firings. The spread of Islamic pottery styles into Europe via trade and conquest left a lasting imprint, inspiring new approaches in places such as Italy, where Maiolica would later flourish. In East Asia, the story was equally rich. The Tang dynasty in China had already introduced the world to its celebrated sanke, or three-colored wares, while the Song dynasty perfected celadon and the ethereal white porcelain that would become China's most famous export. These ceramics were so valued that they were sent as diplomatic gifts to distant courts, including those in the Middle East and Africa. The demand for Chinese porcelain became a driving force in the global economy centuries before the modern era, prompting other regions to attempt imitations. In Japan, potters developed their own distinct traditions, including shino and oribe ware, often emphasizing the beauty of imperfection, asymmetry, and natural glaze effects, a philosophy tied closely to the aesthetics of wabi-sabi and the tea ceremony. Pottery also became deeply entwined with religious and ritual life during this period. In Christian Europe, elaborately decorated chalices and liturgical vessels were often made from precious metals, but in humbler parish churches and monasteries, pottery equivalents filled the same role. In Buddhist Asia, temple offerings and ritual objects were frequently crafted from clay, sometimes glazed, sometimes left unadorned to reflect humility. In Africa, particularly in West African societies like the Nok and later the Yoruba, pottery vessels were central to both daily life and spiritual practices, with forms and motifs carrying symbolic meaning tied to fertility, ancestry, and community identity. Trade continued to shape pottery's development. Along the Swahili coast of East Africa, imported Chinese porcelains and Middle Eastern wares were incorporated into local architecture, sometimes embedded in the walls of houses or mosques as decorative elements, a display of wealth and connection to the wider world. In return, African potters contributed their own works to the currents of Indian Ocean trade. The arrival of new materials and ideas often prompted experimentation. Local artisans might blend foreign decorative motifs with traditional forms, creating pieces that were both familiar and novel. The durability of pottery meant that even when civilizations collapsed or were transformed, their ceramic heritage could endure. Archaeologists studying medieval sites in Europe, Asia, and Africa frequently encounter pottery as the primary surviving evidence of human presence, since organic materials like wood and textiles decay far more readily. These fragments can reveal patterns of diet, trade, migration, and even political alliances. For instance, the presence of a specific type of glaze or clay can pinpoint a pot's origin hundreds or thousands of miles away, offering tangible proof of connections between distant peoples. By the late medieval period, guilds and professional organizations for potters began to emerge in some regions, regulating production standards, prices, and the transmission of skills. In cities like Florence, Seville, and later Delft, such structures helped elevate pottery to a respected craft, sometimes even blurring the line between artisan and artist. The Renaissance would see this trend accelerate, as the rediscovery of classical motifs and the rise of wealthy merchant patrons created a fertile environment for innovation in both form and decoration. All of these developments, technological, artistic, economic, and cultural, demonstrate how pottery was never static. It was a living craft, constantly absorbing influences, responding to changing circumstances, and in turn shaping the societies that made and used it. Even in its simplest forms, a pot was never just a container. It was a statement about who its maker was, where they came from, and how they understood their place in the world. In this way, the pottery of the later medieval era stands as both a continuation of ancient traditions and a bridge to the modern ceramic arts that would flourish in the centuries to come. By the 19th century, the study of ancient pottery had shifted from being a curiosity for collectors to a serious scholarly pursuit, and it was during this time that archaeology began to mature into a scientific discipline. Excavations in places like Greece, Egypt, and the Near East uncovered vast amounts of ceramic material, often in astonishing states of preservation. These finds allowed researchers to develop typologies, systems for categorizing pottery based on shape, decoration, and manufacturing technique. These typologies, in turn, became tools for dating archaeological layers, creating a chronological framework for sites where written records were scarce or non-existent. Pottery fragments, once dismissed as mundane debris, were now recognized as keys to unlocking the rhythms of ancient life. In Greece, for instance, the excavation of Athens' Kerameikos district, the very neighborhood where potters had worked in antiquity, revealed workshops, kilns, and thousands of sherds, providing direct insight into the production process. Black figure and red figure pottery, with its distinctive imagery of gods, heroes, and daily life, became a primary source for understanding Greek mythology and social customs. Even minor details, such as the way a figure's cloak was painted, could help scholars attribute a piece to a specific workshop or even an individual artisan. Meanwhile, in Egypt, pottery from sites like Amarna or Thebes helped illuminate the domestic lives of people who lived thousands of years ago. The shapes and capacities of jars could reveal what goods were stored or traded, while residue analysis, an emerging technique in the 19th century, began to hint at the foods and drinks once contained within. Pottery was also critical in tracing the spread of cultures and the interactions between them. In the Levant, for example, the presence of imported Greek wares alongside locally made vessels spoke of a mingling of traditions, trade, and even migration. By comparing stylistic elements and clay composition, scholars could map ancient trade routes with surprising precision, connecting coastal ports with inland cities and revealing the economic webs that bound disparate regions together. The fascination with pottery extended beyond academia. In Europe, the 19th century saw a wave of neoclassical revival in art and design, and ancient Greek and Roman pottery heavily influenced decorative arts, architecture, and even fashion. Wealthy travelers on the Grand Tour brought home both authentic antiquities and reproductions, fueling a market that sometimes blurred the line between genuine artifacts and skilled forgeries. This demand encouraged further excavations, though not always with the care or ethical considerations modern archaeology demands. In the Americas, pottery provided an equally important window into pre-Columbian cultures. Archaeologists studying the mounds of the Mississippi Valley or the cliff dwellings of the American Southwest found ceramic traditions that spoke of deep-rooted artistry and adaptation to environment. Ancestral Puebloan, black-on-white pottery, Mississippian effigy vessels, and Mesoamerican polychrome wares each told stories of belief systems, agricultural practices, and social structures. These pieces, often richly decorated, showed that complex ceramic traditions existed independently of Old World influence, and that they too carried encoded histories. Technological advances in the 19th century greatly aided the study of ancient ceramics. The invention of photography allowed excavators to document finds in situ before removing them, preserving information about their context that might otherwise be lost. Microscopic analysis of clay minerals helped identify the geological sources of raw materials, while chemical assays began to reveal the compositions of ancient glazes and pigments. These tools allowed researchers to move beyond stylistic comparison alone and build a more scientific foundation for their conclusions. Yet for all the progress, pottery's appeal lay not only in its scientific value, but also in its human touch. A vessel's slight asymmetry might betray the potter's hand, while fingerprints sometimes preserved in the clay could evoke the moment, centuries ago, when a craftsperson set the piece aside to dry. Even the flaws, a warped rim, a glaze run, spoke to the unpredictability of the firing process and the intimate relationship between human skill and natural elements. By the close of the 19th century, museums across Europe and America had amassed vast collections of ancient pottery, often displayed in glass cases as works of art. These collections inspired generations of scholars, artists, and curious visitors to contemplate the civilizations that had produced them. For some, a painted amphora or a humble cooking pot was not just an object from the past. It was a story waiting patiently in clay for someone to read it. In this way, pottery continued to bridge the gap between ancient and modern, serving as both artifact and storyteller, carrying forward the lives, beliefs, and aesthetics of peoples long gone, yet still present through the vessels they left behind. In the 20th century, the study of ancient pottery entered an entirely new phase, shaped by advances in archaeological methods, scientific analysis, and global collaboration. Excavations became more systematic, with careful stratigraphic recording ensuring that pottery was studied in its precise archaeological context. This allowed researchers to link specific ceramic forms and decorative styles to well-defined periods of history, making pottery an indispensable tool for dating entire sites. New scientific techniques revolutionized the field. Petrographic analysis, which involved slicing thin sections of pottery to examine under a microscope, revealed the mineral composition of clays, enabling archaeologists to pinpoint the geographic origins of vessels with remarkable accuracy. Neutron activation analysis, and later X-ray fluorescence, allowed for even more precise sourcing, showing where raw materials were mined and how far finished goods traveled from their place of production. This level of detail turned pottery into a map of ancient trade, migration, and cultural exchange. Residue analysis developed further, using chemical and microscopic study of organic remains trapped in the pores of ceramic vessels to identify the contents they once held, be it olive oil, wine, grains, or even fermented beverages long forgotten. In some cases, this revealed dietary habits, ritual practices, or even the early spread of agricultural products across continents. Technological innovations such as scanning electron microscopy and computed tomography added further layers of insight, allowing scholars to study manufacturing techniques without damaging the artifacts. With these tools, tiny details of brushwork, slip application, or wheel-throwing marks could be examined, often revealing the distinctive signatures of individual potters or workshops. This was the age when pottery could be understood not just as an object, but as a biography, a record of its creation, use, repair, and eventual discard. The 20th century also witnessed a surge in interest in the social and symbolic meanings of pottery. Scholars began to ask not only where and when a pot was made, but also why it looked the way it did, what it meant to the people who used it, and how it reflected broader cultural values. For instance, in ancient Greece, shifts in pottery styles from geometric patterns to more naturalistic figures were linked to changes in social identity and political structures. In the Americas, the intricate designs of Pueblo pottery were understood not merely as decoration, but as carriers of stories, clan symbols, and spiritual beliefs. Museums played a central role during this period, both as keepers of vast ceramic collections and as centers of research. Institutions like the British Museum, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and the Louvre developed specialized departments where pottery was cataloged, conserved, and studied. These museums also made ceramics accessible to the public, fostering appreciation for ancient artistry and craftsmanship beyond scholarly circles. However, the demand for ancient pottery also led to serious ethical challenges. Looting and illicit trade in antiquities became major concerns, with countless pieces removed from their archaeological context and sold on the black market. Without context, much of the historical information they could provide was lost forever. This prompted international agreements, such as the 1970 UNESCO Convention, aimed at curbing the illegal export and sale of cultural heritage. In the latter half of the century, pottery studies became increasingly interdisciplinary. Collaborations between archaeologists, chemists, geologists, and anthropologists enriched interpretations and encouraged broader perspectives. For example, ethnographic studies of modern traditional potters provided analogies for understanding ancient production techniques and social roles. Experimental archaeology also gained traction, with researchers recreating ancient kilns and firing methods to test hypotheses about how historical ceramics were made. By the century's end, digital technology was beginning to leave its mark. Computer databases allowed for the cataloging of massive ceramic collections, enabling comparisons across continents. Three-dimensional scanning and modeling opened new possibilities for virtual reconstruction of vessels from fragments, allowing scholars to visualize complete forms without physically altering the artifacts. These developments not only deepened our understanding of ancient ceramics, but also made the knowledge more widely shareable, setting the stage for the global, connected study of pottery that would define the decades to come. Through it all, pottery remained a constant link between past and present. From humble cooking pots to elaborately painted amphorae, each vessel held within it the trace of human hands, the needs of daily life, and the artistic vision of its maker. In a century that saw extraordinary advances in science and technology, ancient pottery proved that sometimes the most enduring stories are those told not in words, but in clay, quietly waiting, often for millennia, to be read once more. By the early 21st century, the study of ancient pottery entered what could be described as its most interconnected and technologically advanced phase. Archaeologists, historians, scientists, and even independent researchers from around the world began sharing data in real time, creating global databases that allowed pottery finds from one excavation to be compared instantly with others from distant continents. This connectivity meant that a sherd discovered in a small village in Anatolia could be linked within hours to a complete vessel found decades earlier in a museum in Paris, revealing trade patterns and cultural connections that would have been nearly impossible to trace before. Advances in digital imaging allowed pottery fragments to be scanned in 3 dimensions, with extremely fine resolution that captured every curve, chip, and mark on the surface. These models could be rotated, scaled, and compared virtually, allowing researchers to fit broken pieces together without risking damage to the originals. Entire vessels could be digitally reconstructed from just a handful of shards, offering visual insights into shapes and designs that had not been seen for thousands of years. These same models could be shared with scholars and the public alike, bringing ancient pottery out of the storage rooms and into classrooms, research labs, and even personal devices worldwide. The use of geographic information systems, GIS, became standard practice, enabling researchers to map the distribution of pottery styles, clay sources, and decorative motifs over vast areas. This spatial perspective helped clarify how styles evolved, how technology spread, and how ancient communities interacted with one another. Combined with radiocarbon dating, thermoluminescence, and even DNA analysis of organic residues trapped within the clay, pottery was no longer just a silent witness to the past. It became a multi-layered record of human activity, technology, and movement. At the same time, the role of pottery in public history and heritage tourism grew significantly. Archaeological parks and museums began to use interactive exhibits where visitors could handle replicas, simulate pottery-making techniques, or watch digital reconstructions of ancient workshops. These efforts not only made history more engaging, but also underscored the fact that pottery, while often considered humble or utilitarian, could serve as a key to unlocking grand historical narratives. Yet, this new age also brought challenges. The black market trade in antiquities persisted, now fueled in part by online sales and private collectors willing to pay high prices for rare pieces. To combat this, many countries tightened export controls, increased site monitoring, and invested in public awareness campaigns to highlight the damage caused by looting. International cooperation between law enforcement and cultural heritage organizations became crucial, as did the use of technology like digital watermarking of 3D scans to help track stolen artifacts. Meanwhile, experimental archaeology continued to play an important role. Modern potters, sometimes working in collaboration with scientists, recreated ancient kilns, tools, and techniques to better understand production methods. By replicating the process from clay preparation to firing, researchers could test hypotheses about the conditions under which certain types of pottery were made, how long they lasted, and how they responded to everyday use. This hands-on approach bridged the gap between ancient theory and modern observation, deepening the connection between past craftspeople and contemporary scholars. Interdisciplinary research also began to examine the cultural and symbolic roles of pottery in societies, looking beyond its physical attributes to explore how it conveyed identity, status, or beliefs. For instance, certain pottery designs once dismissed as purely decorative were reinterpreted as visual codes or narratives tied to myth, politics, or social order. In some cases, the patterns on vessels turned out to be stylized maps, genealogical records, or symbolic representations of cosmology. In the broader context, ancient pottery also found a place in discussions about sustainability and environmental history. The study of ceramic waste in ancient settlements offered clues about consumption patterns, recycling practices, and the long-term environmental impact of human activity. These insights not only enriched historical understanding, but also provided lessons for modern society about resource management and resilience. By the end of the first decades of the 21st century, ancient pottery was no longer confined to the realm of archaeology alone. It was embraced by artists, educators, scientists, and communities as a tangible connection to the human story. Whether displayed in a high-tech museum, reconstructed in a virtual lab, or examined under a microscope in a field tent, each vessel, shard, and fragment continued to whisper details about the hands that made it, the people who used it, and the journeys it took across time and space. It was a reminder that, even in an age of rapid technological change, the quiet durability of clay could still carry voices from the distant past into the present, ensuring that the stories it held were never truly lost. In the years to come, the study of ancient pottery is likely to evolve even further, blending traditional archaeological methods with technologies that were once the stuff of science fiction. Artificial intelligence is already being tested to analyze vast image databases of pottery fragments, recognizing patterns, shapes, and motifs faster than any human could, while also suggesting potential matches between pieces from different collections. These AI tools, combined with machine learning algorithms, can predict missing portions of vessels with remarkable accuracy, offering virtual restorations that give both scholars and the public a clearer vision of the past. Another frontier lies in chemical and isotopic analysis, where even the most minute traces embedded in the clay or absorbed into the ceramic walls can reveal astonishing details. Residue analysis might identify what a vessel once held, be it wine, olive oil, spices, or even medicinal concoctions, while isotopic signatures can indicate the geographic origin of the clay or the materials used in decoration. This level of precision means that a single cup, long buried and forgotten, could tell us not only who made it and where, but what it carried and perhaps even who drank from it. Such revelations further blur the line between the everyday and the extraordinary, showing that objects once deemed mundane may in fact have played pivotal roles in trade, ritual, or daily survival. The accessibility of pottery research is also set to expand dramatically. As 3D scanning, augmented reality, AR, and virtual reality, VR, become more widespread, people from anywhere in the world will be able to explore virtual reconstructions of ancient workshops, markets, and households, seeing the pottery in its original context, rather than behind a glass case. Students might virtually walk through a bustling Bronze Age harbor, observing amphorae being loaded onto ships, or watch artisans shape wet clay on a wheel under the smoky light of an ancient kiln. These immersive experiences have the potential to transform the way history is taught and understood, making it not only more engaging, but also more empathetic, bridging the gap between modern lives and ancient ones. There is also a growing recognition of the cultural and emotional dimensions of pottery, especially in communities whose heritage has been fragmented or erased by war, colonization, or displacement. For many, pottery is more than an archaeological artifact. It is a living thread of identity. In some cases, modern craftspeople are reviving ancient styles and techniques, not simply for art or tourism, but as acts of cultural restoration, reclaiming a history that was nearly lost. This resurgence reinforces the idea that pottery, unlike some forms of history locked in archives, can still be touched, shaped, and made part of everyday life. Yet the future will not be without its tensions. Climate change poses new threats to archaeological sites, from rising sea levels that erode coastal settlements to desertification that buries or exposes fragile remains. Protecting pottery in situ will require urgent action, balancing preservation with the needs of living communities. At the same time, ethical debates will continue over the ownership of artifacts, whether they should remain in museums far from their origins or be repatriated to the countries and cultures that created them. These conversations will test the boundaries of international cooperation and the definition of cultural stewardship in the modern era. Still, for all these challenges, the essential allure of ancient pottery endures. It remains one of the most democratic forms of historical evidence, made by hands both skilled and unskilled, used by the wealthy and the poor, and scattered across every inhabited continent. Each shard holds a fragment of the human experience, whether it is a painted myth from a royal palace or a plain, unadorned bowl from a humble kitchen. In studying them, we gain not only data about chronology, trade routes, or artistic styles, but also glimpses into the small, unrecorded moments that made up most of human history. The meals shared, the rituals observed, the journeys taken. As long as there are questions about who we are and where we came from, the careful, patient work of interpreting ancient pottery will remain relevant. Future generations may have tools we can scarcely imagine today, but they will still kneel in the dust of an excavation, lift a fragment to the light, and feel the same quiet thrill that has animated archaeologists for centuries. And in that moment, they will understand what those before them have always known: that sometimes the most enduring stories are not carved in stone or written on parchment, but shaped in clay, fired in the heat of a kiln, and passed, piece by piece, through the unbroken chain of human hands across the ages. That concludes our previous story. Before we move on to the next one, I would be grateful if you could give me a like and a subscribe. And now, let us continue with the next chapter in our Boring History for Sleep series, as we turn to the builders behind the Great Wall's lesser-known sections. Under the dim glow of an early dawn, before the sun could cast its first golden light across the rugged hills of northern China, the faint clink of tools could be heard echoing through the valleys. It was not the sound of armies marching, nor the noise of bustling markets, but the quieter, persistent rhythm of laborers preparing for another day's work. These were the builders, ordinary men and women, tasked with raising the Great Wall's lesser-known sections, the ones far from the postcard views and tourist paths. In the minds of many today, the Great Wall appears as a single continuous ribbon of stone, winding over mountains and disappearing into the horizon, but in reality, it was built in countless segments over centuries, each shaped by the local landscape, available resources, and the people who constructed it. While the grand and fortified sections near Beijing received the most attention, there were long stretches built in remote areas using earth, tamped clay, or local stone. And it is here, away from the ceremonial gateways and garrison towns, that the stories of the unsung builders live. These workers came from various walks of life. Some were conscripted soldiers fulfilling service to the empire. Others were peasants paying their taxes in labor rather than grain. And still others were skilled artisans hired for their knowledge of masonry, carpentry, or rope making. They did not arrive at the worksite with any illusions of glory. Their daily concerns were survival, completing the day's tasks, and perhaps earning enough food or coin to send back to their families. The work began with surveying the land. Foremen would walk the ridgelines, measuring distances, marking spots where towers would rise, and deciding how best to align the wall with natural defenses like steep slopes or rivers. Once a plan was set, the builders worked in teams, some digging into the earth to lay foundations, others gathering materials from the surrounding countryside. In the remote deserts of Gansu, This meant layers of reeds and gravel mixed with clay, while in the rocky hills of Shanxi, they used local granite blocks, each shaped and fitted by hand. The labor was relentless. Days were long, stretching from first light until the shadows grew long in the evening. In the colder months, wind would slice through the layers of cloth and leather, numbing fingers and stiffening joints, while in the summer, the sun could bake the ground until it cracked, dust rising in the air with every step. Meals were simple, steamed millet or sorghum, perhaps a few pickled vegetables, and water was carried from distant streams in buckets hung on poles across the shoulders. Despite the grueling conditions, there were moments of quiet camaraderie. Workers would share stories around small fires at night, exchanging news from their villages, or telling tales of legendary generals and mythical beasts said to roam the hills. Some found ways to carve their names or short messages into stones before they were placed, tiny marks of their presence that might outlast their own lifetimes. The building of these sections was not just an engineering challenge, it was also a logistical feat. Supplies had to be moved over difficult terrain, with donkeys and oxen carrying stones and timber along narrow paths. Rope, nails, chisels, and shovels all had to be repaired or replaced, and skilled hands were needed to ensure that each section could withstand not just the threat of invaders, but also the relentless erosion of time and weather. The lesser-known stretches of the Great Wall may not have been as tall or as wide as the ones designed to impress visiting envoys, but they were no less important. They served as the first line of defense in regions where enemy raids were more likely to come suddenly and without warning. The watchtowers here were smaller, often manned by just a handful of soldiers, but they still kept the signal fires ready to warn the garrisons to the east. For the builders, the wall was not an abstract symbol of imperial might. It was a job, a duty, and for some, a punishment. Yet in fulfilling their roles, they became part of a project that would stretch across centuries and leave a mark not only on the landscape, but also on the collective memory of a civilization. Theirs was a legacy without statues or royal proclamations, but one built into the very earth and stone they laid. And though their names are largely lost to history, the lesser-known sections of the Great Wall stand as silent testimony to their endurance, skill, and quiet sacrifice, their story woven into the fabric of one of humanity's greatest constructions. The construction of the lesser-known sections of the Great Wall in the 17th century did not happen in isolation. It was part of a broader web of imperial policies, local obligations, and regional adaptations that reflected the realities of life in those remote stretches of the empire. By the time these particular walls were being built or reinforced, the Ming dynasty was entering a period of increasing pressure from both internal instability and external threats. The main purpose of these outlying segments was not to impress visiting dignitaries, but to serve as functional, quickly built barriers that could be manned by smaller forces, delay enemy movements, and give nearby towns and garrisons time to prepare. The builders understood that speed was often as important as strength, and this meant using materials that were close at hand. In arid areas, they layered tamped earth mixed with straw, creating thick, compact walls that could be built without transporting heavy stone over long distances. In mountainous zones, local stone was favored, shaped roughly on-site and set with mortar made from lime and crushed seashells. The design of the wall here was practical rather than ceremonial. Parapets were lower, towers were smaller, and many stretches followed the natural contour of ridges, using the terrain itself as part of the defense. The workers themselves formed a patchwork of humanity, drawn from every corner of the surrounding provinces. Drafted soldiers labored alongside peasants fulfilling corvée duties, while itinerant craftsmen moved from site to site, trading their expertise for steady pay and rations. There were also those sent as punishment, petty criminals, political dissidents, or debtors, who found themselves in these remote work sites as part of their sentence. Life was harsh and discipline strict. Overseers enforced quotas, ensuring that each team completed a certain length of wall within a set period. Those who lagged behind could face extra shifts, reduced rations, or physical punishment. Yet within this strict framework, there was also a sense of collective purpose, as the men and women on the wall knew that their work might one day be the barrier between their villages and disaster. Days were structured with a military precision. At dawn, a drum or horn would sound, signaling the start of labor. teams set out to quarry stone, mix mortar, or haul materials up steep slopes using wooden sledges and crude pulleys. The rhythmic thud of hammers against chisels carried through the morning air, mingling with the calls of team leaders directing the placement of each block. By midday, when the sun was high and the heat oppressive, work slowed slightly as workers sought shade where they could. Meals were brief, usually consisting of a handful of millet balls, sometimes dipped in a thin broth if supplies allowed. Water, carefully rationed, was fetched from distant wells or streams, and everyone understood the value of every drop. The afternoons were often the hardest, as fatigue set in and the wind picked up, blowing dust into eyes and mouths. Still, the work continued until the light began to fade, at which point tools were cleaned, fires lit, and the workers gathered in small groups to eat, talk, and rest. At night, the atmosphere shifted. The chatter around the campfires told of home villages, family weddings missed, or harvests that might fail in their absence. Some sang quiet songs passed down for generations, while others worked by the dim light of oil lamps to mend clothing or repair tools. For a few, the act of carving initials into a hidden section of stone was a way of leaving proof that they had been there, that their hands had shaped the wall, even if no one would ever know their names. The challenges they faced were not only physical. The isolation of these sites meant that supplies could be delayed for weeks by storms, landslides, or bandit raids. Illness could spread quickly in the cramped living quarters, and without trained doctors, minor wounds could become life-threatening. And yet, through all of this, the wall continued to grow, a testament to the sheer determination of those who built it. Today, these lesser-known sections remain largely unvisited, weathered and overgrown in places, but still standing against the same winds and rains that battered the builders centuries ago. They do not have the grandeur of the restored sections near the capital, but they are perhaps more honest, bearing the marks of human hands and the realities of frontier life. Every uneven stone, every weathered tower, tells of days when survival depended not on the glory of emperors, but on the grit of ordinary people working together in the shadow of history. The story of the lesser-known sections of the Great Wall is not only a record of construction techniques and military necessity, it is also a story of human endurance and adaptation in environments that tested every skill and ounce of strength the builders possessed. By the third season of work on one particular stretch in the rugged hills north of Gansu, the workforce had settled into a rhythm that blended hard labor with the seasonal cycles of the land. The approach of spring was marked not just by the melting of snow along the higher ridges, but by the arrival of supply. Caravans carrying fresh tools, sacks of millet, and bundles of dried vegetables from the lowland markets. These caravans were lifelines, bringing not only food and materials, but also news from the outside world. Changes in court politics, shifting alliances among regional lords, and the occasional rumor of new threats along the frontier. For the builders, each delivery was both a relief and a reminder of the isolation of their post. The leadership at these sites was usually a mix of military officers and civilian overseers, each with their own priorities. The officers pushed for rapid completion of defensive features, towers, parapets, and signal platforms, while the civilian overseers managed the flow of supplies, labor schedules, and the allocation of scarce resources. Friction between the two groups was common, but both understood that cooperation was essential if the project was to survive the unpredictable challenges of frontier life. The design of the wall in this area reflected the realities of defending against fast-moving raiding parties rather than large-scale sieges. Towers were spaced more closely together than in other regions, allowing for quicker signal relay via smoke by day and fire by night. Narrow stairs inside the towers allowed defenders to move between levels swiftly, and narrow arrow slits provided cover, while giving a wide field of fire over the valleys below. On the wall itself, the walkways were deliberately rough and uneven, a tactic to slow advancing enemies should they gain access. For the laborers, mastering the terrain was as important as their skills with tools. Steep, rocky slopes demanded ingenuity in moving heavy stone blocks, often requiring the construction of temporary wooden ramps anchored into the hillside, or the use of sledges greased with animal fat to slide loads into place. Water was equally precious, and teams were rotated to dig and maintain cisterns that could store enough to last through the dry season. Every stone laid, every bucket of earth tamped down, was the product of carefully coordinated effort. The climate here could shift dramatically within hours. A morning could begin with clear skies and end with sudden, fierce winds that whipped dust into a blinding haze. Winter brought not only snow, but temperatures that turned stone hard as iron, making it nearly impossible to shape or set. Yet halting work was rarely an option. Any delay risked leaving a section vulnerable and incomplete, a gap that enemies might exploit. The social fabric of the builders' camp was a delicate balance. Skilled masons and carpenters often held a slightly elevated status, given better rations or more comfortable sleeping arrangements, as their expertise was considered vital. Farmers and laborers, while essential, sometimes resented this hierarchy, especially when workloads felt uneven. But necessity forged unlikely alliances. One man's skill at repairing a wheel, another's knack for finding wild herbs to supplement the thin stew, or a woman's ability to stitch heavy leather into protective gear could mean the difference between hardship and disaster. Evenings in camp were moments of fragile peace. Fires were lit in shallow pits shielded from the wind, and meals were shared from large communal pots. Some workers would carve simple patterns into scrap wood or stone, creating small tokens to send back home when messengers traveled. Others played makeshift instruments, flutes fashioned from bone, or drums from stretched animal hide, filling the cold air with music that, if only for a while, pushed back the loneliness of the frontier. Oral storytelling flourished in these gatherings. Tales of past dynasties, heroic generals, and supernatural guardians of the wall were passed around, weaving the builders into a tradition that spanned centuries. Some believed the wall itself had a spirit, watching over those who worked on it, and offerings of food or wine were sometimes left at the base of newly completed towers. The sense of participating in something larger than themselves sustained many through fatigue and injury. By the end of the third season, the wall stretched further across the hills, its towers standing like sentinels against the horizon. It was not perfect. Sections still needed reinforcement, and weather would take its toll. But it was functional, and more importantly, it was theirs. The people who built it might never see their names recorded in the chronicles of the capital, but every stone carried the memory of their labor, their hopes, and their stubborn refusal to yield to the harshness of the land. In their quiet way, they had shaped both the wall and the history it guarded. By the time the fourth year of construction began on these lesser-known sections of the Great Wall, the work had evolved into a carefully orchestrated routine that balanced the demands of defense, the limitations of the environment, and the resilience of the people who toiled here. The builders were no longer strangers to the land. They understood the rhythm of its seasons, the quirks of its weather, and the challenges hidden in its rugged contours. The mountains and valleys had a way of revealing their secrets slowly, and the men and women who labored along these ridges had learned that patience was as valuable as strength. Supplies arrived at staggered intervals, brought by long lines of mules and ox carts that wound their way through narrow passes. Each arrival was an event in itself, a temporary break in the monotony of daily labor. The creak of wooden wheels, the calls of drivers urging their animals forward, and the scent of goods wrapped in reed mats brought a burst of life to the camps. Rice, millet, dried vegetables, pickled roots, and salted fish were stored in dugouts lined with stone, while new chisels, ropes, and iron nails were counted and distributed with care. These provisions were more than sustenance. They were reminders of the world beyond the frontier, of bustling markets and warm hearths far away. The work itself remained grueling. The wall here was not a single continuous line, but a series of interlinked segments designed to control movement through the terrain. Some sections rose steeply from sheer cliffs, their base stones sunk deep into the bedrock, while others snaked along gentle ridges where earthen cores were faced with tamped clay and stone slabs. Every day began before sunrise. Laborers were divided into crews, each assigned to a specific task: quarrying stone, mixing mortar, hauling materials, or laying the courses of the wall. The quarry crews worked in teams of 3 or 4, using wedges and hammers to split stone from the mountainside. Once freed, the blocks were loaded onto sledges and dragged by hand or animal to the construction sites. On steeper inclines, ropes and pulley systems were rigged, and the work became a slow, methodical dance of coordination. The soundscape of the wall was its own kind of music. The steady clink of chisels, the thud of mallets, the grunt of effort as a block was shifted into place. Supervisors moved among the crews, checking alignment, ensuring that joints were tight, and that each section met the specifications needed to withstand both time and enemy attack. The engineers, often former soldiers or court-trained builders, worked with simple tools, plumb lines, water levels, and measuring rods, but their precision was unwavering. Life in the camps required just as much discipline as the work on the wall. Fires were lit only in designated pits to conserve fuel, and water was rationed according to strict schedules. At night, sentries walked the perimeter, listening for the distant howl of wolves or the approach of strangers. Illness was a constant threat, especially in the damp chill of early spring and the biting cold of winter. Simple remedies, herbal teas, poultices made from local plants, and broths rich with bones were shared among the sick, though not always enough to save them. Yet even in hardship, moments of humanity shone through. A mason might share a story from his village to lighten the mood during a long day. A cook might slip a bit of extra meat into the pot for the crew that had hauled the heaviest loads. Friendships were formed in the quiet hours after work, as men and women sat near the fire, mending clothes, sharpening tools, or simply staring into the flames, thinking of the families waiting for them. As the wall extended further into the hills, the builders developed new techniques to adapt to the landscape. In swampy lowlands, they laid stone foundations over layers of packed reeds to prevent sinking. In rocky areas, they carved the bedrock to create a level base, ensuring stability. The towers in this stretch were built with multiple internal chambers, allowing for storage of grain and arrows, as well as shelter during storms. Signal systems were refined, with each tower equipped with designated areas for beacon fires. Their smoke visible from miles away during the day, and their flames cutting through the night. The purpose of their work was always present, even if the threat felt distant. Raiders could appear with little warning, and the wall was as much a statement of presence as a physical barrier. For the builders, it was also a legacy, a structure that would stand long after they were gone, a testament to their endurance. The fourth year brought new challenges, but also a sense of mastery. They knew how to pace themselves in the heat, how to brace against sudden storms, how to read the sky for changes in weather. The work had etched itself into their bodies. Calloused hands, strong backs, and the steady gaze of people who had learned to measure time, not in days or months, but in stones set and towers raised. And though they might never be celebrated in official histories, the wall bore their imprint in every line and joint, a silent record of their lives on the edge of the empire. By the fifth year of work on the lesser-known stretches of the Great Wall, the project had become a living organism in itself, with its own cycles, rhythms, and unspoken rules. The builders, many of whom had been here since the first foundation stones were laid, now moved with a quiet efficiency born of experience. They no longer wasted energy on unnecessary movements, and every tool, every gesture, every shouted instruction served a purpose. The wall was advancing steadily into the rugged terrain, tracing the natural contours of ridges and valleys, adapting itself to the stubborn landscape, like a river carving its bed over centuries. The encampments had grown more permanent. What had once been temporary tents and makeshift shelters were now sturdier dwellings made from stone and timber, built to withstand the cutting winter winds and the searing summer sun. Narrow lanes formed between the rows of huts, and each crew had its own designated area for eating, resting, and storing tools. Fires were carefully tended to provide both warmth and cooking heat, their smoke curling upward in thin streams that could be seen from miles away. Supplies arrived with more regularity now, as the supply lines had been secured. Caravans brought sacks of grain, bundles of firewood, iron fittings, and sometimes small luxuries: dried fruit, tea leaves, or cloth for repairs. These small comforts, rare in the early years, lifted morale in ways that were not easily measured, but the work remained hard. The fifth year saw the construction of more complex defensive towers along this section of the wall. Unlike the simpler watchtowers of previous stretches, these had multiple stories, with arrow slits positioned at carefully calculated angles and internal staircases built from stone slabs. Some towers even had concealed storage rooms for weapons and emergency supplies, meant to sustain defenders for weeks if they were cut off from reinforcements. Each tower had to be built on a solid foundation, often requiring deep excavation into the bedrock. Laborers worked in shifts, digging through soil and stone, reinforcing walls with timber beams, and laying heavy stone blocks in perfectly aligned courses. Mortar was mixed in large pits, using lime, water, and sand, then carried in buckets to the masons who applied it with practiced precision. Coordination was essential. Crews communicated through a combination of shouted orders, hand signals, and the unspoken understanding that came from years of working side by side. At times, the air was filled with the rhythmic thud of hammers, the scraping of chisels, and the creak of wooden scaffolding swaying in the wind. The weather, as always, dictated the pace. Spring rains turned paths into rivers of mud, making the transport of materials exhausting. Summer heat baked the earth until it cracked, forcing the workers to cover their heads with cloth and drink water sparingly. Winter was the hardest. Numb fingers struggled to grip tools, and icy winds cut through even the thickest layers of clothing. Yet in every season, the wall grew taller and stronger. The human side of this monumental effort was equally complex. Friendships deepened among those who had endured the same hardships together. There were shared jokes told around the fire at night, quiet conversations in the early dawn, and the occasional song sung in the dialect of a distant home. Births and deaths both occurred in the shadow of the wall, children born to camp women, old laborers succumbing to illness or injury. Funerals were simple, with stones placed to mark the graves, but they were attended by all, for in this isolated frontier, every life mattered. The relationship between the builders and the soldiers who guarded the frontier was one of mutual dependence. The soldiers relied on the builders to complete the fortifications, while the builders depended on the soldiers for protection from raiders or wild animals. At night, torchlight flickered along the partially completed stretches, a reminder that even in rest, vigilance was constant. The fifth year also brought new innovations. Engineers experimented with mixing crushed plant fibers into the mortar for added strength, and certain sections of the wall were faced with smoother stone to make climbing more difficult. Drainage channels were cut into the base to prevent water from pooling and weakening the structure. These details might go unnoticed by outsiders, but to the builders, they were marks of progress, proof that their labor was not only enduring, but improving over time. Though none could predict how long the work would continue, there was an unspoken acceptance among the builders that their own lives were now tied to the wall's fate. For many, this section of the frontier had become home. The seasons turned, the wall grew, and the world beyond the mountains seemed increasingly distant. They knew they might never walk the bustling streets of the capital again, but here, in the quiet persistence of stone upon stone, they were leaving behind something greater than themselves, a line of defense and a symbol of endurance that would remain long after their hands had grown still. By the 6th year of construction on these lesser-known stretches of the Great Wall, the project had entered a phase where every movement was guided not by guesswork, but by deeply ingrained skill and long months of accumulated practice. The crews had grown into tightly knit units, each person knowing exactly where they fit within the rhythm of work. Masons, carpenters, haulers, and mortar mixers moved with a quiet synchronicity, as if each day was part of an unending sequence, repeated until perfection was achieved. The wall itself was beginning to take on a character that reflected the land it guarded, winding over jagged ridges, descending into steep valleys, and cutting across barren plains where the wind never seemed to stop. In some places, the terrain was so inhospitable that the builders had to invent new methods on the spot. Sheer cliffs required anchors to be driven deep into the rock to hold scaffolding, and narrow passes had to be fortified in ways that allowed defenders to cover every possible approach. Where the ground was too soft to hold the weight of stone, layers of compacted earth were laid first, tamped down over days until they became firm enough to serve as a base. These were the kinds of solutions that never made it into the imperial records, but they were the lifeblood of the wall's real construction. Life in the encampments continued its steady pulse. The camps now resembled small villages, with designated areas for tool-making, food preparation, and storage. Some families had been living here so long that their children could barely remember another home. The laughter of these children often mingled with the clang of tools and the call of foremen directing crews. Evenings were spent around the fires, with meals of millet porridge or flatbread baked on heated stones, and the telling of stories that blended fact and legend until no one could say where one ended and the other began. The soldiers stationed here had become part of this extended community, their watchtowers now linked by completed stretches of wall, that allowed signals to pass quickly from one end to the other. Fires were lit in signal braziers to send word of approaching weather, incoming supply trains, or the rare but serious threat of raiders. Testing the frontier. The sense of shared purpose between soldier and builder grew stronger with each year, for both understood that the wall's strength was not just in its stones, but in the people who kept it alive. This year saw an increase in decorative work, a sign that the leadership wanted these lesser-known sections to display not only strength, but a measure of imperial pride. Some tower walls were faced with precisely cut stone blocks, their edges so straight they cast razor-sharp shadows in the sunlight. Carved inscriptions were added at certain points, recording the names of overseers and the dates of completion. A few decorative tiles, painted in deep blues and reds, found their way into gateways, lending a touch of refinement to an otherwise austere structure. The challenges, however, remained relentless. The summer heat could make the stone so hot that it burned bare hands, and the winter winds froze water in the mortar before it could set properly. Tools wore down quickly on the unforgiving rock, and replacing them meant waiting for shipments from distant workshops. The men and women here had grown used to improvisation, reshaping broken chisels, weaving rope from whatever fibers could be gathered, even using scraps of leather as makeshift gloves when supplies ran low. Yet the wall kept growing, and with it grew the sense that they were part of something no single lifetime could contain. Many of the workers had never seen the capital city or the vast palaces their labor protected. But in quiet moments, standing atop a newly finished section and looking out across the rugged frontier, they could feel the weight of their work in the stillness of the land itself. This was not the kind of glory that would earn their names a place in official records, but it was the kind that would outlast their bones. The 6th year's work concluded with the linking of several major towers, creating a continuous line of defense across a particularly vulnerable stretch. When the last stone was set and the final bucket of mortar smoothed into place, the overseer allowed the crews a rare day of rest. They gathered on the wall itself, sharing food, laughter, and a few quiet toasts with whatever wine could be spared. For a brief moment, the endless labor paused, and the wall stood not just as a barrier, but as a testament to human endurance, born of calloused hands, weathered faces, and a will that refused to bend before the demands of stone and time. By the 7th year of work on these lesser-known stretches of the Great Wall, the builders had settled into a rhythm that felt almost timeless, though the seasons continued to impose their will on the pace of progress. The early spring thaw brought both relief and trouble. The frozen ground softened, making it easier to dig foundations. Yet the meltwater flooded trenches and carried away soil that had been painstakingly leveled. Crews rose earlier now, working while the air was cool and the light was still soft, knowing the sun would soon climb high and turn the stones into radiant plates of heat. The work itself had grown more complex, for the wall was no longer just a rising line of stone. It had to be integrated with the terrain in a way that made it both defensible and enduring. Where the mountains pressed close, the wall was forced to cling to the rock, its foundation drilled into the ridges. Where the land opened into plains, wide bastions were built to allow defenders to move in greater numbers. And in the deep, narrow passes, massive gates were raised, each one fitted with iron-bound doors that could be closed at a moment's notice. The engineers, often dressed in robes rather than work tunics, walked the line daily, measuring angles, checking mortar consistency, and ensuring that every stretch met the precise demands of imperial planning. In the camps, life followed the steady beat of work, rest, and survival. Fires burned long before dawn so that porridge would be ready when the workers woke. The blacksmiths, always surrounded by a clanging rhythm of hammer on metal, repaired chisels, reshaped nails, and forged the iron spikes needed for scaffolding. Tailors patched the heavy winter cloaks that would soon be stored away, while coopers tightened the bands of water barrels to prepare for the hot months ahead. Children, now older than when the project began, had taken to small tasks, fetching water, gathering kindling, or carrying messages between sections. The camaraderie among the workers had deepened over these years, but so too had the quiet weariness in their eyes. They knew that for every stretch finished, there was another awaiting their hands. The 7th year also saw a new kind of challenge, maintaining what had already been built. The winds here could be merciless, stripping mortar from joints, and the frost could split stone that had been set with care. Maintenance crews worked alongside the builders, repointing walls, replacing damaged blocks, and ensuring that the integrity of the earlier work was preserved. This dual burden, building new sections while keeping the old intact, added hours to the workdays and demanded a level of endurance that tested even the most seasoned hands. Yet the pride in the structure remained strong. From atop the wall, the view stretched so far that the horizon seemed to dissolve into the sky. The towers, spaced like silent sentinels, caught the morning light in their pale stone, and the winding line of the wall itself looked almost like a river of rock flowing across the land. For the soldiers stationed here, the 7th year brought improved living quarters, with sturdier barracks and better storage for supplies. They shared meals with the builders more often, their conversations blending talk of patrols and weather with the practicalities of construction. It was becoming clear to everyone that the wall was more than a military barrier. It was a lifeline, binding together communities that might otherwise have remained isolated. In moments of pause, especially during the long evenings when the air cooled and the scent of burning pine drifted over the camp, older workers would speak of the wall as if it were a living thing. They described it as breathing with the seasons, growing with every stone, and carrying the memory of each person who had worked upon it. For some, this wall was the greatest thing they would ever build, a labor that would outlast them, and perhaps even their children. By the close of the 7th year, a significant milestone had been reached. A particularly treacherous mountain stretch, long thought nearly impossible to fortify, had been completed. The crews celebrated modestly, sharing hard bread, dried meat, and a few cups of wine, and then returned to work the next day as if nothing had changed. For the wall demanded constancy above all else, and those who built it had learned that its endurance was not in grand moments, but in the steady, unbroken rhythm of hands and stone, day after day, year after year. By the 8th year of construction on these remote and often overlooked sections of the Great Wall, the builders had become not only craftsmen, but also custodians of an evolving monument that seemed to stretch endlessly into the horizon. The early months of that year began with an unseasonably cold spring, the kind that delayed the thaw and left frost lingering in the shadowed gullies well into the planting season. This meant the ground was still hard when work resumed in earnest, and picks rang against stone with a sharper, more brittle echo. Yet the crews persisted, for by now they had learned that the wall was as much a test of endurance as it was of skill. The imperial overseers, recognizing the importance of these lesser-known stretches in securing trade routes and remote villages, sent additional materials: higher quality limestone from a distant quarry, cedar timbers treated to resist rot, and even new iron tools forged in the capital. These supplies arrived in long caravans, guarded by soldiers who brought news from the cities, stories of court politics, and the subtle reminder that the emperor's eyes were always on the progress being made. The construction sites had grown into semi-permanent settlements by now, with families of workers living in huts clustered near the wall's base. There were gardens where vegetables were grown between work shifts, small workshops for carpenters and masons, and even a rough meeting hall where disputes were settled and instructions read aloud. The sense of permanence was undeniable, and some began to wonder whether they would ever return to their old homes or if they had become, in a sense, people of the wall. The work that year was marked by a shift in focus toward integrating defensive innovations. Arrow slits were positioned at precise angles to allow maximum range while minimizing exposure to return fire. Towers were designed not just as watchpoints, but also as mini fortresses where supplies could be stored and where small groups of defenders could hold out for days if needed. Water collection systems were improved, with stone-lined cisterns capturing rain and snowmelt to reduce the dependence on distant wells. The summer heat was relentless that year, the kind that pressed down on the workers like an extra weight. Shifts were rearranged to begin before dawn, allowing crews to work in the cooler hours and rest during the worst of the midday sun. Even so, there were days when the air shimmered above the stone, and men wrapped their heads in damp cloth just to keep from fainting. The sound of chisels striking stone became almost hypnotic, a rhythm broken only by the calls of overseers or the creak of wooden scaffolds shifting under the weight of loaded baskets. By autumn, the 8th year's achievements were evident. Long, continuous stretches now connected what had once been isolated segments, creating a seamless defensive barrier over the ridges and valleys. Patrol routes were established, and soldiers began to move along them with an ease that suggested the wall had already altered the way this frontier was defended. For the local villagers, the wall was a new reality, its shadow now a part of daily life. Markets sprang up near the gates, where traders sold dried fish, salted meat, and bolts of cloth to both soldiers and workers. Children, who had once been shy of the imposing structure, now played in its shade, weaving games around its base and imagining themselves as great defenders against unseen enemies. The wall had become part of their stories, part of their games, and perhaps part of their identity. The camaraderie among the builders reached new depths during that year. They had endured storms, droughts, injuries, and the constant grind of labor together, and bonds had formed that went beyond mere necessity. In the evenings, small groups would gather around fires, sharing food, telling tales, and sometimes singing old songs that carried the scent of faraway homelands. They spoke less of when the work would be done, and more of how their part of the wall would be remembered. By the end of the 8th year, as the last stones were set before the winter pause, the wall stretched farther than many had believed possible. Its lesser-known sections, though far from the ceremonial grandeur of those near the capital, were no less impressive. In their quiet strength, in the way they held the mountains and plains together, they embodied the persistence of the people who had built them. These builders knew their names would likely be forgotten, but their work, the wall itself, would remain, a silent testament to their hands, their endurance, and their years upon the stone. By the 9th year of work, the lesser-known sections of the Great Wall had begun to resemble a continuous, living organism, rather than a series of disconnected construction zones. The project had reached a stage where the initial rawness of the stonework was softened by the natural weathering of time, and yet each day brought fresh labor to extend its reach. The cold of the previous winter had been harsh, driving snow into the valleys and forcing the workers to spend the first weeks of the new season repairing damage from frost and ice. Some sections had shifted slightly under the weight of frozen water seeping into their joints, and so the masons carefully removed compromised stones, replacing them with new ones cut to fit so precisely that they seemed to have grown there. The repairs were meticulous, for everyone knew that weakness in one place could compromise the safety of many miles of wall. That year also saw an increase in the complexity of the defensive features being added. Engineers from the capital arrived, their robes marked with the insignia of the imperial court, carrying scrolls that detailed new designs. These included more sophisticated watchtowers with reinforced parapets, hidden storage compartments for arrows and supplies, and even narrow staircases that allowed defenders to move between levels without being exposed to enemy fire. Some workers marveled at the ingenuity of these plans, while others muttered that they made the wall seem less like a barrier and more like a fortress city spread thinly across the mountains. The logistics of sustaining such a large workforce had also evolved into a finely tuned operation. Supply caravans now arrived on a regular schedule, bringing food, tools, and materials from far-off provinces. Traders followed them, offering luxuries, sweet preserved fruits, bolts of silk, and even small metal trinkets that brightened the lives of those who had been away from home for nearly a decade. The exchange of goods and stories between workers and traders created a culture that was unique to the wall's frontier, a blending of dialects, cuisines, and customs that could not be found anywhere else in the empire. The daily rhythm of work was unchanging but somehow comforting. Before dawn, the camp would stir, fires crackling as porridge was cooked and tea brewed. Crews were assigned their sections, and by the time the sun rose over the peaks, the sounds of hammers, chisels, and shouted commands filled the air. In the heat of midday, tools were set down, and men and women alike would seek the shade of the wall, eating their simple meals while leaning against the very stones they had laid. By late afternoon, the pace would slow as the sun dipped, casting long shadows across the valleys below. With the passing years, the wall had not only changed the landscape, but also reshaped the lives of those living near it. Villages that once lay exposed to raids now thrived under the wall's protection. Farmers tilled their fields with a renewed sense of security, knowing that the watchtowers stood as silent guardians over their labor. Even the wildlife seemed to adapt, with birds nesting in the crevices and small animals using its shadow for shelter during the heat of summer. For the builders, there was a growing awareness that their work was nearing a kind of completion. Not that the wall would ever truly be finished. There would always be repairs, expansions, and reinforcements. But the core of this section was taking its final shape. This realization brought with it a mix of pride and melancholy. Pride in knowing that their hands had shaped something enduring. something that would stand long after they were gone. Melancholy because the wall had become their home, their community, and the thought of leaving it felt like abandoning a part of themselves. As winter approached in the 9th year, a final push was made to connect the last gaps in the continuous line of stone. Crews worked by torchlight in the early evenings, the glow of flames flickering against the gray surfaces, giving the wall a ghostly, almost ethereal appearance in the dark. The overseers were relentless in their demands, urging the workers to finish before the snow returned, and so the nights rang with the sound of stone meeting stone, echoing into the cold air. By the year's end, the once isolated segments had become a formidable chain of defense, winding over the hills like a serpent of stone. The lesser-known sections might never draw the attention or reverence of the great ceremonial gates or the stretches near bustling cities. But to those who built them, they were no less magnificent. In their eyes, these stones were not merely a wall. They were the memory of 9 years' labor, the laughter shared in the evenings, the injuries endured, and the friendships forged. It was a monument not just to imperial will, but to the quiet, enduring resilience of the people whose sweat had bound stone to stone, year after year, until the wall became as much a part of them as they were a part of it. By the 10th and final year of construction on these lesser-known sections of the Great Wall, the air around the site carried a peculiar stillness, as though the land itself understood that an era was drawing to a close. The once raw landscape, marked by the sounds of chisels striking stone and carts creaking under heavy loads, now echoed with a quieter rhythm, one of finishing touches, inspections, and farewells. The wall stretched in an unbroken line over ridges and valleys, its stones weathered by wind and rain, yet standing solid and proud. What had begun as scattered construction points now formed a seamless barrier, guarded by watchtowers that looked out over plains, rivers, and distant mountains. Each section had its own character, shaped not only by the terrain, but by the hands and minds of the people who built it. In the early months of that final year, teams of craftsmen worked to carve inscriptions into certain stones, records of the imperial decree that had ordered the wall's construction, the names of overseers, and sometimes, in smaller and more discreet script, the names of common laborers who wanted to leave some trace of their part in this monumental effort. Some etched symbols meaningful only to their families. Others carved brief blessings for the safety of those who would guard the wall in years to come. These quiet acts of personalization gave the wall a soul beyond its military purpose. By spring, the construction camps had begun to thin. Many laborers who had spent years here were returning to their home provinces, carrying with them not just their wages, but the skills they had learned: masonry techniques, carpentry methods, even the art of organizing large-scale work in difficult terrain. For them, the wall was more than stone. It was a teacher, a challenge that had reshaped their bodies and their ways of thinking. In the evenings, those still on site would gather around fires, sharing stories of the harsh winters survived, the dangerous slopes conquered, and the camaraderie that had carried them through exhaustion and injury. As summer came, the wall saw its first real test runs. Small groups of soldiers were stationed along its length, learning how to patrol the new watchtowers, how to signal across distances using flags or smoke, and how to navigate the hidden passages and storage areas designed to keep them supplied during sieges. The builders watched with quiet satisfaction as the military adapted to this new line of defense, knowing their work was now shifting from creation to preservation. Logistics also began to change. Supply caravans, once laden with timber, stone, and mortar, now brought goods for the permanent garrisons: grain, dried meat, tea, and firewood. Markets sprouted near the larger gates, where traders sold fresh vegetables, fabrics, and pottery to both soldiers and civilians who had settled nearby. The wall had given rise to a small but thriving economy, an unplanned legacy that would continue long after the builders left. By autumn, the imperial inspectors arrived, dressed in richly embroidered robes and accompanied by scribes. They walked the length of the wall, measuring its height and thickness, testing the stability of its gates, and questioning the overseers about every detail. Their presence brought tension. No one wanted a flaw to be found this late in the process, but also a sense of importance. This was the formal acknowledgement that the wall was ready to serve its purpose. The final weeks of construction were marked by a ceremonial atmosphere. Banners were hung from some of the watchtowers, and at certain points along the wall, Incense was burned as an offering to the spirits of the land and to honor the labor of those who had toiled here. In one particularly moving moment, a group of workers stood together at dawn, watching the sun rise over the wall for the last time before their departure. The light spilled across the stones, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch endlessly into the future. For them, it was a reminder that though they would leave, their work would remain, weathering storms, resisting invasions, and witnessing the slow passage of centuries. When winter came, it brought with it a deep, contemplative quiet. Snow settled gently into the crevices between the stones, softening the wall's edges and making it appear almost like a natural ridge of the mountains themselves. The garrisons now fully occupied their posts, moving along the parapets with the steady, measured steps of those who knew their duty. The builders were gone, their camps dismantled, but traces of their presence remained. In worn paths leading to quarries, in the fire pits now cold and filled with ash, and in the countless fingerprints left in the mortar between the stones. The lesser-known sections of the Great Wall would never draw the same crowds or legends as the famous stretches near the capitals, but perhaps that was fitting. Their purpose had never been to impress visiting dignitaries or to serve as backdrops for grand ceremonies. They existed to protect the quiet villages, the farmlands, and the remote trade routes that sustained the empire in ways less visible but equally vital. And in that quiet, they stood, year after year, as monuments to resilience. Not only the resilience of stone against time, but the resilience of the people who built them, who poured a decade of their lives into a work they knew they might never see celebrated. Yet for those who understood, no recognition was needed. The wall itself was the testament, and its endurance would be their legacy. Thank you for watching this video. I wish you a wonderful new day filled with luck and energy. See you again on the Sleep Whisper channel.